A billionaire receives an unexpected message from his ex-wife. He thinks it's just another request for help, but what he discovers next changes everything. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. James Bennet woke earlier than usual, feeling strangely restless in his expansive Manhattan penthouse. The gleaming sunrise pressed through floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the living room in a gentle glow that contrasted with the sterile perfection of polished marble floors and meticulously arranged furniture. He liked order. He thrived on discipline. Yet on this particular morning, none of those precise details comforted him. For James, age 45, and at the top of his game as the CEO of Bennet Tech Solutions, order had always been his shield against uncertainty. Each day followed a predetermined schedule, from his personal trainer arriving at 5:30 in the morning to his carefully curated nutrition plan. Even the blend of coffee in his automated espresso machine never varied. He had built his empire by leaving little to chance, embracing the controlled environment of conference rooms, market projections, and sealed business deals. While others might see his life as lonely, he rationalized that solitude was a byproduct of focus. He had chosen success over distraction. At least, that was the story he told himself. That morning, however, a simmering unease disrupted his routine. He took a deep breath and stepped onto his balcony, gazing at the sprawling view of Central Park. Instead of finding solace, he found a swirl of conflicted emotions. Memories floated forward, the kind that had a habit of surfacing when he was least prepared to face them. Specifically, the memory of Liliana, his ex-wife. They had divorced 5 years ago, after a tempestuous, short-lived marriage. Liliana had been his polar opposite, an artist with a heart full of spontaneity and warmth. She was 38 now, but his mind kept conjuring images of her at 33, arms splashed with paint, eyes glowing with creative fire. They had tried to salvage their relationship multiple times, but their final desperate attempt in Paris still lingered like a half-forgotten dream. James sipped his coffee slowly, letting the taste ground him. He reminded himself that Liliana was part of a past he'd locked away. He had chosen to move forward, to bury all the tumultuous feelings in boardrooms and expansions. And he had succeeded in building Bennet Tech Solutions into a juggernaut, particularly after sealing a series of mergers that catapulted the company onto the world stage. Just as he allowed this sense of pride to replace the nagging thoughts of his ex-wife, James's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was unusual for anyone to message him this early, aside from his personal assistant or Andrew Williams, his longtime friend, now 50, and the only person who knew him beyond his corporate persona. With mild curiosity, James reached for the device. The screen displayed a name he never expected to see again. Liliana. His heart skipped a beat. He tried to compose himself with a clearing of his throat, but a surge of tension set in. Why was she contacting him now? After 5 years of utter silence, she had no reason to reach out unless it had something to do with money. The memory of their divorce negotiations flashed in his mind. Liliana had been oddly calm, refusing substantial spousal support, insisting she wanted a clean break. Unlike many in his circle, she never leveraged his wealth to gain anything beyond the final settlement. She simply walked away. He hesitated before opening the message. When he finally tapped the screen, he found only a brief sentence. "We need to talk about that night in Paris." Instantly, the carefully constructed walls around his heart cracked. Was she referring to the last night they spent together? A make-or-break romantic getaway? He had not let himself dwell on it for years. A flurry of questions gripped him. Was this a cryptic scheme to request financial assistance? Did she discover something from their past that required his signature or permission? He locked the phone and paced across the room. Rationality told him to ignore the message. After all, Liliana had made her choice, and so had he. Yet another part of him, the part he rarely allowed to speak, recalled her face that night, heartbreak mingled with hope, a final plea for him to choose their marriage over his relentless pursuit of success. It was a memory he could never entirely shake off. Stepping into the marble-tiled hallway, he paused by a framed photo tucked discreetly on a side table. It was from an award ceremony years ago, with Liliana by his side. She looked radiant, wearing a gentle smile. He remembered how proud she had been that evening, not just of his recognition, but of them, together. The ache in his chest intensified. He clenched his fists, then relaxed them slowly, as if releasing something intangible. James inhaled, trying to dispel the knot tightening in his stomach. Ignoring her message might be simpler, but was it wise? Why would Liliana bring up that night now, of all times? His logical mind insisted there could be countless reasons, none of which he truly wanted to deal with. Yet he found himself typing a cautious reply. "What do you want, Liliana?" He stared at the words, contemplating whether to send them. Suddenly, a wave of doubt crashed over him. Before he could second-guess himself further, he tapped send. With that one action, James felt the first tremor of unease in his pristine world. Whether he liked it or not, Liliana's message had jolted him out of complacency. Standing there, phone in hand, he sensed that whatever was coming next would shatter the careful order he had cultivated and, in a way he couldn't yet comprehend, upend his life forever. Early the next day, James arrived at Bennett Tech Solutions amid the sleek glass and steel that dominated Midtown Manhattan. The bustling lobby, with employees hurrying across polished floors, generally made him feel in command. Today, however, he couldn't shake the memory of Liliana's message from his mind. Her words, "We need to talk about that night in Paris," echoed in every quiet pause. His executive assistant, Yolanda, greeted him with the day's agenda, meticulously organized on a tablet. "Morning, Mr. Bennett," she said in a measured tone. "You have an 8:30 meeting with the product design team, followed by a conference call at 9:30 with the executives in San Francisco." He gave her a curt nod, accepting the schedule. Yet, as Yolanda walked away, he barely noticed her departure. His thoughts remained fixed on his phone. Liliana hadn't responded to his terse question. If she had intended to ask for money, wouldn't she have replied by now? Pushing open the door to his corner office, a modern space framed by panoramic windows, James scanned the skyline. The city pulsed with energy, feeding his usual hunger for success. But as he sank into his chair, he realized the usual thrill felt muted. Suddenly, the clang and clatter of construction outside caught his attention, and he found himself oddly grateful for the distraction. At least the noise forced his mind to focus on the present moment. He decided to look over the latest reports, but found himself reading the same line repeatedly, unable to absorb its meaning. Annoyed, he set the documents aside. The memory of Paris intruded, uninvited. He recalled a candlelit dinner at a hidden bistro, Liliana's gentle laughter, and the final argument in their hotel suite that ended in tears. In the back of his mind, he began to wonder what Liliana wanted him to recall about that pivotal evening. Not long after, Andrew Williams stepped in, closing the office door behind him. Andrew's presence had always been reassuring, a sharp legal mind. Yes, but also a friend who had witnessed James's rise from ambitious graduate to billionaire entrepreneur. His tall frame and calm demeanor often tempered James's more impulsive tendencies. "You seem off your game," Andrew observed, settling into a chair opposite the desk. "Everything all right?" James hesitated, feeling reluctant to expose any vulnerability. "I got a message from Liliana," he said finally, keeping his tone even. "She wants to talk about some night in Paris." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "That's cryptic, but it must be important enough for her to reach out after all this time." James shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "I suspect she needs help, though it's odd she hasn't spelled it out." "She was never the type to ask for anything without reason." Andrew leaned forward, tenting his fingers thoughtfully. 5 years is a long time. People change. Maybe she's changed too. James exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders. "Whatever it is, I can't let it disrupt my focus right now. I have crucial deals in the pipeline. We're about to finalize negotiations with Blackwell Industries. It's the next big step for the company's global expansion." Andrew nodded. "You're right, but ignoring Liliana won't make her go away." Before James could respond, Yolanda knocked and announced the design team had arrived. Andrew stood to leave, offering a measured pat on James's shoulder. "Talk to her, even if it's just to find out what she wants. Sometimes the simplest path is the direct one." Sighing, James watched Andrew depart. He steeled himself for the meeting, adopting the confident facade his team expected. Yet, throughout the presentation of new tech prototypes and marketing strategies, he found his attention drifting. The hum of data points and projected revenue figures washed over him, leaving him strangely numb. Midway through the conference, his phone vibrated. Trying to remain unobtrusive, he glanced down. A new text message: "Please meet me at Charlie's Cafe, tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's on Fulton Street in Brooklyn. I'll explain everything then." The sender, Liliana, he almost dropped the device, his heart hammering wildly. The design lead paused, noticing James's sudden distraction. Coughing to mask his unease, James waved a hand for them to continue, but internally he was reeling. Why Brooklyn? Why such a modest location when Liliana knew how he despised small, crowded places? The day stretched on in a haze. Between back-to-back meetings, he replayed Liliana's words in his head. "I'll explain everything." James felt a simmering mixture of anxiety, anger, and peculiar anticipation. Part of him wanted to tell her no, he had more than enough on his plate. But another part, one he rarely acknowledged, feared that refusing might close off the answer to a question he never even knew he had. By the time evening arrived, James found himself alone in his office, staring at the skyline again. His reflection in the glass looked tense, mouth set in a grim line. He realized this was no trivial matter. Liliana was well aware that he valued privacy. If she chose a casual cafe in Brooklyn, it meant she truly wanted to avoid attention or drama. That alone spoke volumes. Rubbing his eyes, he flicked off the office lights and headed to the elevator. Tomorrow at 10, he would see Liliana for the first time in 5 years. The thought sent a tremor through him. He wondered how she might look, if her hair was still cut in that slightly asymmetrical style she favored. Would her eyes still hold that spark he had tried so hard to forget? As the elevator descended, he forced his mind to quiet. On the surface, this was just a meeting, something to tick off on his schedule so he could return to his empire building. Yet deep down, he sensed that once he stepped into Charlie's Cafe, his pristine life would no longer remain quite so under his control. That night, James slept fitfully. Thoughts of Liliana colored his dreams with fragments of a past he'd tried to bury, laughing in Parisian art galleries, strolling along the Seine, and then the cold finality of their parting words. He woke before dawn, chest tight as if he had run a marathon. His penthouse felt imposing and hollow, the silence broken only by the hum of the central air system. Instead of following his usual ritual of a pre-work gym session, James lingered in his kitchen, letting his coffee grow tepid in its porcelain cup. He felt a heavy reluctance, a clinging desire to keep everything exactly as it was. Yes, his life was lonely and strictly orchestrated, but it was predictable. No matter how hollow, it was safe. Shortly after, he dressed in his usual tailored suit and made his way to the garage, stepping into the back seat of his chauffeured town car. The driver gave a respectful nod. James responded with only a curt greeting, too wrapped up in his own thoughts to make small talk. The ride to the office felt longer than usual, each traffic light an opportunity for him to question whether meeting Liliana was a mistake. Yet he had agreed, implicitly. Another part of him, one he refused to label as hope, had pushed him to confirm. If there was closure to be found, he had to face it eventually. Upon arriving, he was greeted by a swirl of typical corporate demands. A security report that required his signature, a call from overseas investors wanting updates on a new product release. Normally, he thrived on this kind of relentless pace, but now it only aggravated the sense of suffocation. Every task felt mundane, overshadowed by the knowledge that in a few hours he would come face to face with the woman he once believed would be his partner for life. By mid-morning, Andrew stopped by to discuss pending legal matters. Sizing up James's clouded expression, he closed the door softly behind him. "You look like you're about to go 12 rounds in a boxing ring." James forced a brittle laugh. "I feel like it. My mind's in 1,000 places, and none of them have to do with work." Andrew tilted his head sympathetically. "Look, you don't have to do anything you don't want to, but you've come this far. Maybe it's best to just hear Liliana out." James pressed his lips together, nodding reluctantly. "I suppose I owe her that much. We never truly had a conversation after signing those final papers." Andrew placed a file on the desk. "Here's the draft for the next partnership agreement. Review it when you can. And James, take this one step at a time." Sighing, James watched his friend leave. The meeting with Liliana loomed over him like a thunderhead. He was due to depart the office soon, if he intended to reach Charlie's Cafe in Brooklyn by 10. He could have cancelled the meeting, just typed a quick text, something like, "I'm busy, let's reschedule." But deep in his gut, he knew that would be a coward's move. 40 minutes later, James found himself stepping out of a car into a part of the city that bore little resemblance to his usual haunts. Fulton Street was busy in a more grassroots way, small shops with handwritten signs, local bakeries, families strolling by with kids in strollers. The sweet smell of fresh pastries wafted from a nearby storefront. It felt oddly comforting and unsettling at the same time, a slice of life that rarely touched him. He spotted the cafe's modest sign and realized how incongruous he must look. A powerful billionaire in an impeccably tailored suit, standing on a worn sidewalk in front of an unremarkable brick building. For a moment, he debated just turning around and returning to his chauffeur. But he steeled himself and pushed open the glass door. Inside, the aroma of ground coffee beans enveloped him. A few patrons looked up, mildly curious, then went back to their own breakfasts. Liliana was seated in a booth near the back, wearing a simple navy blue sweater. She looked different, thinner, a bit pale, but she still had the same regal posture and deep brown hair. When her eyes met his, he felt that same old tug in his chest he'd once tried so hard to deny. Gathering his composure, James walked over and slid into the booth across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the espresso machine and hushed chatter of other customers formed a strange background hum. He could see the tension in her face, the set of her jaw. She clasped her hands around a mug as if seeking warmth. "Liliana," he said at last, voice low, "you look well." She offered a fleeting smile. "I guess that's a kind way to put it. Her gaze dropped to the steam rising from her coffee. "Thank you for coming." James nodded, unsure what to say. A waitress appeared briefly, and he ordered a black coffee, barely registering his own words. The hush that followed weighed heavily. Summoning courage, he fixed his attention on her. "Your message mentioned Paris," he managed. "I admit I'm curious why that night matters all these years later." Liliana hesitated. He noticed the faint tremor of her lips before she spoke. "There's no easy way to say this, James, but we do need to talk about that last night we spent together, just before everything ended." He swallowed, his chest tight. "What about it?" Her eyes flicked up, brimming with a mix of resolve and anxiety. "Just listen carefully, please, because what I'm about to tell you will change everything." James felt the urge to protest that nothing could truly change his life now. He was set in his path. But something in her voice silenced him. He nodded, bracing himself. The old fear of emotional vulnerability surged, but he forced it down. He wasn't the same man as 5 years ago, at least he hoped so. Whatever Liliana had to reveal, he would hear her out. Because deep inside, he suspected that once he walked away from this cafe, there would be no turning back. Liliana took a moment to steady herself. James could see her knuckles whitening against the coffee mug. The cafe's mellow chatter seemed distant as he waited for her to speak, every instinct telling him to guard his emotions, brace for the worst. His logical mind conjured a dozen possibilities: money, illness, betrayal. Yet her demeanor suggested something far more profound. Finally, she spoke in a measured tone, each word clearly chosen. "After that final argument in Paris, I discovered I was pregnant." The sound of plates clinking across the cafe blurred into a dull roar in James's ears. He blinked, certain he must have misheard. "Pregnant," he echoed, voice trailing off. Liliana nodded, lips pressed in a tense line. "I was so sure that you'd pick your business over anything else, over a family. We were on the brink of separation, and I just couldn't face another rejection. I made the decision to leave, to raise our daughter on my own." His thoughts whirled, 1,000 questions crashing into one another. A daughter. All that time, he had a child living somewhere in the same city, or maybe somewhere else entirely. Panic and an odd sense of wonder roiled within him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, unable to keep the slight tremor from his voice. Liliana sighed. "I convinced myself it was for the best. You'd never shown that you could prioritize anything above your company. I wanted our child to grow up with stability, not a father who was perpetually absent." A wave of conflicting emotions swept through James. Rage, guilt, heartbreak, they all collided, leaving him speechless. He recalled every business trip, every grueling negotiation he'd thrown himself into, believing he was forging a legacy. But now that legacy felt meaningless compared to the child he never knew. Finding his voice, he asked, Where is she? Does she live here? What's her name?" "Sophie," Liliana replied, her expression softening momentarily. "She's 4. She lives with me, in a small apartment near Prospect Park." She glanced away for a beat. "She has your eyes, James, green like summer leaves." He rubbed a hand over his face, trying to absorb the jarring truth. "Why now? Why tell me after all these years?" Liliana took another breath, mustering courage. "Because I'm sick. I was diagnosed with cancer, ovarian, 8 months ago. The treatments are intense. I'll need more aggressive sessions soon. I can't take care of Sophie by myself during that time." A rush of protective instinct surged through him, mingled with sorrow. "Cancer? Liliana, I'm so sorry." It felt woefully inadequate, a hollow phrase, but he meant it sincerely. He stared at her slim face, noticing the shadows around her eyes. She had always been radiant, full of an artistic spirit that drew people in. Now she looked as though life had weighed her down, though her gaze still held a quiet determination. She nodded faintly, accepting his words. "I've tried to manage on my own, but it's getting harder every day. I'm going to need treatments that will leave me exhausted. And Sophie, she's already picking up on my fatigue. She's just a child, James. She deserves to have someone strong around." A pang of guilt cut through him, sharper than anything he'd felt in years. "I'll help," he said, his voice resolute. "Whatever you need, medical bills, a better place to stay, let me arrange it. I'll provide everything." She shook her head gently. "It's not about money. It's about you. Sophie doesn't need some faceless benefactor. She needs a father, someone who cares enough to be there in person, not just send checks." He swallowed hard, recalling how often he'd tried to fix problems by writing a check. It was what he knew best, throwing money at an issue until it vanished. But in the face of fatherhood and serious illness, that approach felt pathetically insufficient. He struggled to formulate an answer. "I can be there, but I also have a massive enterprise to run, deals in motion. I can't just—" Liliana lifted a hand, her tone shifting to a touch more exasperated. "I'm not asking you to drop everything and vanish from your world. But I do need to know if you can give Sophie and me some real commitment, even if it's not perfect. I'm preparing for the worst in my treatment, James. It might get ugly." He stared down at the table. The old, familiar tug-of-war erupted within him. He had always prided himself on controlling every aspect of his life. Now, faced with a daughter he had never met and an ex-wife who was gravely ill, he couldn't simply rely on strategy or negotiation. For the first time, he feared that no matter what he chose, someone or something important would slip through his fingers. He looked back up into Liliana's eyes. "I want to meet Sophie," he said, voice tentative yet firm. "I want to see her, to understand who she is. If we're doing this, I should start there." Liliana's tense features softened. Relief mingled with apprehension in her expression. "All right. Let's take it step by step." In the muted light of the cafe, James felt the weight of his decision press down on him. He had given Liliana his word, though he still had no clue how he would balance fatherhood, the demands of a multinational corporation, and the emotional upheaval that came from reopening old wounds. A swirl of conflicting thoughts taunted him. Could he truly be a parent? Would Liliana's treatment derail the final pieces of his carefully curated empire? Yet the choice felt inevitable. The moral conflict was clear. He would either rise to the challenge or risk losing what little chance he had at forging a meaningful bond with his daughter, and perhaps, in the process, finally discovering the deeper meaning his life had always lacked. James left the cafe, feeling as though an invisible weight now lay across his shoulders. The Manhattan skyline loomed in the distance, shimmering with midday light. He phoned his driver to pick him up, then stood against the building's faded brick exterior, wrestling with the whirlwind of thoughts that threatened to consume him. Liliana had asked him to come by her apartment the following afternoon to meet Sophie. The prospect both unsettled and intrigued him. He had never interacted meaningfully with a child before. Certainly, he donated to countless pediatric charities, shaking hands for photo ops, but that was different, formal, distant. This was personal, unbelievably so. When his car finally arrived, he slid into the back seat, instructed his driver to take him home rather than the office. For once, James found himself unwilling to face the swirl of corporate responsibilities. He needed space to think. Staring out the window at the passing streets, he marveled at the everyday scenes: parents walking hand in hand with children, an elderly couple chatting on a bench. These small human moments carried a weight he had long overlooked. By the time he reached his penthouse, the sun hung low in the sky. Rather than calling his assistant or checking his messages, he loosened his tie and wandered to the window, gazing at the city lights beginning to flicker on. How many times had he congratulated himself for his single-minded drive, believing that forging a corporate legacy justified every personal sacrifice? Now, the thought that he had a 4-year-old daughter, someone who might need him in a far more profound way, unraveled the confidence he'd spent years building. Determined to get some clarity, he reached for his phone and dialed Andrew. Within minutes, Andrew agreed to come over, sensing the urgency in James's voice. The doorbell rang half an hour later, and James welcomed his friend into the spacious living room, where they sat on the leather couch near a minimalist fireplace. Andrew leaned forward, concern etched across his features. "You sounded rattled on the phone. Is this about Liliana?" James let out a heavy sigh. "She just told me we have a daughter, Sophie. She's 4, and Liliana is really sick. Cancer." He paused, absorbing the gravity of those words as if for the first time. Andrew's eyes widened. He looked momentarily lost for words. "My God, I'm sorry. That's a lot to take in." "Tell me about it," James muttered, raking a hand through his hair. "Everything I thought I knew is suddenly different." Andrew glanced around the impeccably curated space. "What do you plan on doing?" James stared into the dormant fireplace. "I told Liliana I'd help. She doesn't want my money. She wants me to actually be there. I'm supposed to meet Sophie tomorrow." Andrew nodded, a thoughtful glint in his eyes. "You know, maybe it's exactly what you need. You've always been driven, but you've also, well, you've pushed people away." James gave a short laugh devoid of humor. "That's a polite way of calling me a workaholic hermit." Andrew shrugged. "Call it what you want. But if Liliana's health is on the line and a child is involved, it may be time to reevaluate your priorities." They lapsed into silence. James heard the steady hum of traffic below. Finally, Andrew spoke again. "This is a real chance to build something meaningful beyond corporate dominance. Don't waste it." That night, James found little sleep. When he finally did drift off, he dreamed of holding a small hand in his, yet every time he looked down, he couldn't see the child's face clearly. He awoke in the pale morning light, heart pounding, mind swirling with anticipation and dread about meeting Sophie. By midday, he found himself standing outside Liliana's apartment building, a modest red brick structure near Prospect Park. The faint aroma of freshly cut grass from a nearby patch of lawn lingered in the air. Nervous energy coursed through him as he stared at the brass apartment buzzer. Liliana answered the door, her expression a mixture of fatigue and guarded hope. She was dressed casually, looking more like the vivacious artist he once knew, despite a slight pallor to her skin. The apartment was small but warm. A few colorful paintings adorned the walls, some likely her own work. His gaze flicked to a corner filled with children's books and a tiny wooden table scattered with crayons. Then he saw Sophie. She peered from behind Liliana's legs, clutching a small stuffed rabbit with one ear partially frayed. James's breath caught in his throat. The child's hair was dark and softly curled, but her bright green eyes were unmistakably his. In those curious wide eyes, James recognized a reflection of his own gaze in the mirror, yet softer, unguarded. Liliana knelt beside Sophie. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "this is James. He's your father." A quiet hush stretched in the living room. Sophie studied James, her grip on the rabbit tightening. His heart thundered. He was painfully aware that the next moments mattered more than any billion-dollar negotiation he'd ever led. Summoning the warmth he rarely showed in public, James crouched down to Sophie's eye level. "Hi, Sophie," he said softly, managing a small smile. "It's nice to meet you." For a second, the girl didn't move. Then she shuffled forward a step. "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The gravity of that single word struck James harder than any boardroom victory. He realized that she, for all his successes, he had never truly felt so vulnerable or so invested in making something right. As Liliana watched them, eyes glistening with unshed tears, James offered Sophie his hand, and in that innocent gesture, her small fingers curling into his, he sensed the beginning of a journey that would change his life in ways he could scarcely imagine. By the time James stepped out of Liliana's apartment building, the autumn sun was drifting behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of orange and lavender. He couldn't recall a single day in his career that had felt quite as significant as this one. Meeting Sophie, his own daughter, had upended everything he thought he knew about himself. Despite the swirling intensity of that revelation, he couldn't deny a strange surge of hope. Perhaps, for once in his life, he was about to do something that truly mattered beyond the boardroom. Still, a current of uncertainty ran through him, as if he were standing on the brink of an abyss. He pulled his phone from his pocket and, without much forethought, dialed Andrew's number. Though Andrew was his attorney, he had also become one of the few people James trusted implicitly. "Good evening," Andrew greeted. "How did it go?" James hesitated, trying to encapsulate the day's tidal wave of emotion into a coherent response. "I met her, Sophie. I'm still trying to process it all. She looked at me like I was a stranger, which I guess I am." He paused, exhaling slowly. "I don't know how to be a father, Andrew. I've spent years shutting people out so I could focus on building my company. Now I find out I have a 4-year-old who needs me." Andrew's voice softened. "You won't have all the answers on day 1 or day 10, but you can't treat this like a merger. There's no tidy contract to sign and finalize. It's a relationship that grows with time, patience, and genuine presence." James halted on the sidewalk, absorbing Andrew's words as traffic bustled around him. "I'm not sure I have the skills for that," he admitted, recalling the awkwardness he felt when trying to talk to Sophie, how he hadn't known what to say or do. "You have the capacity," Andrew said firmly. "You just need to let yourself care. Let yourself be vulnerable. That's the real challenge, my friend." James ended the call feeling slightly more anchored. Andrew was right. Becoming a father demanded far more than financial support or logistical planning. It required something intangible, emotional commitment. The next morning, James arrived at Bennett Tech Solutions and found Andrew in his office, leafing through a stack of documents. They agreed to tackle pressing legal matters, but the atmosphere in the room felt different, less formal. Andrew had always known James's business side. Now he was witnessing a personal transformation that neither of them could quite define. "So," Andrew began, setting the files aside, "you asked me to gather some information on family law, just in case." James nodded, slipping off his suit jacket and hanging it over his chair. "I want to be prepared. Liliana's asked me to help, so I might need official guardianship if her health worsens. I'm not saying we need to formalize everything today, but I want to know my options." Andrew reached for a legal pad. "I understand. You're looking to create a safety net for Sophie." James leaned forward. "Exactly. I don't want her drifting through the system if Liliana's condition takes a turn for the worse. Liliana might trust me in principle, but the law can be complicated." Andrew scribbled a few notes, then looked up. "Of course. However, you should keep in mind what Liliana truly wants. She may not want you to rush into court filings. She might be looking for something more meaningful, your consistent presence." James rubbed his temples. "You're right. If I approach this like a transaction, I'll end up alienating both Liliana and Sophie." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'll talk to Liliana before we put anything down on paper, But in the meantime, how do I even... He faltered, struggling to phrase his question. How do I learn to be a father? Andrew released a quiet laugh, though his tone was warm. No manual exists, but maybe you should speak to someone who has navigated a similar path. You need an advisor for fatherhood, not just corporate expansions. James sat quietly, letting the idea settle. He realized that despite Andrew's unwavering support, Andrew wasn't a parent himself. Another guide might be beneficial. A name came to mind, Miss Anderson. She was an older neighbor Liliana had once mentioned, someone who'd been a kind of surrogate grandmother to Sophie. Perhaps Ms. Anderson could help him grasp the everyday details of childcare and emotional nurturing. It was a humbling realization. James Bennett, the billionaire mogul, seeking counsel on how to hold a child's hand or read a bedtime story. Before Andrew left, he gave James a measured look. You're crossing into unfamiliar territory, but you're not alone, remember that. With that final note, Andrew handed him the folder of legal summaries and stepped out. Left alone in his office, James felt the weight of new responsibility pressing on him. Liliana's illness, Sophie's sudden presence in his life, and the demands of his global enterprise converged, threatening to overwhelm him. Yet a small spark within him felt alive. For the first time in years, he was more than a man chasing profits. He was stepping onto a path that required heart over calculation, and oddly enough, that filled him with a cautious sense of possibility. James glanced at the cityscape through the window. It glimmered with promise, as though encouraging him to find the courage within himself. Perhaps Andrew was right. He was capable of caring deeply. He just had to choose it. Day after day, mistake after mistake. Taking a steady breath, he resolved that, mentor or not, he would attempt to be the kind of father Sophie deserved, and the kind of man Liliana could rely on in her greatest hour of need. The next few days unveiled a stark contrast between James's old life and the new reality taking shape around him. For years, he had thrived on relentless structure, investor calls at dawn, product development meetings that spilled into late nights. The sense of control had been both his armor and his identity. Now, with Sophie's existence shaping his perspective, he found himself questioning every priority. On a crisp morning, James stood before his board of directors, discussing the status of a major deal with Blackwell Industries. PowerPoints glowed on the screen, showcasing projections of synergy and market dominance if the fusion proceeded. As he spoke, his words carried their usual confident cadence, but beneath the surface, his mind drifted to Sophie's curious green eyes and Liliana's fragile health. One of the board members, a no-nonsense woman named Catherine Park, eyed James skeptically once the presentation ended. "Mr. Bennett," she began, "this is a vital moment for our company. We need to ensure your full availability. The negotiations with Blackwell will demand travel and a near-constant presence. Are you still able to dedicate yourself entirely?" He cleared his throat, knowing the truth would rattle them. "I have some personal obligations arising, but I'm prepared to handle both. We'll structure a team to manage day-to-day tasks if I need to step away." An uneasy hush settled over the conference table. For a man known to be obsessively present, James's casual mention of stepping away from the helm was practically unheard of, yet he refused to elaborate. His private life was his own, and the board didn't need every detail. After the meeting, Catherine approached him alone. "James, if you don't mind me being blunt, you've always been laser-focused on the company. Now you're distracted. Is there something we should be worried about?" He maintained a practiced calm. "My circumstances have changed. I'm not abandoning Bennett Tech Solutions, but I need more flexibility in the coming months. Trust me to balance it." Her gaze flickered, but she nodded. "I hope you know what you're doing." Leaving her behind, James descended to the underground parking garage. The weight of the board's expectations clashed with his newfound role as a father. He knew decisions lay ahead that would test his dedication, yet there was no turning back. He had, in effect, already bid farewell to the illusion that work could fill every void in his life. Now, he had to negotiate an uncharted territory, one that demanded empathy and vulnerability rather than ceaseless hustle. That evening, James revisited Liliana's apartment. He brought a small bouquet of sunflowers, recalling a distant memory that Liliana had always adored, their bright color. He also carried a picture book for Sophie, a whimsical story about a rabbit exploring a magical garden. He felt awkward holding such items, more accustomed to expensive wines or artisanal gift baskets for corporate clients. Still, he hoped these gestures might bring a hint of cheer. When Liliana opened the door, James noticed she looked more tired than the last time he'd seen her. Shadows rimmed her eyes, but she mustered a faint smile. "Hello, James. Thanks for coming by." He stepped in, offering the flowers. "I remember you said these were your favorite." Her brow lifted in mild surprise. "I did, didn't I?" She took them carefully, her voice tinged with gratitude. "They're perfect." Sophie was in the living room, coloring at her miniature table. The TV played a low-volume cartoon, but she seemed more engrossed in her crayons. James approached slowly, heart pounding in a way no business pitch had ever made it pound. "Hey, Sophie," he said, crouching down. "I brought you a new book. Maybe we can read it later." She stopped coloring to examine the cover, featuring a cuddly rabbit. Her gaze shifted to him, uncertain yet curious. "Thank you," she murmured quietly. Then she went back to her drawing. But James felt a tiny flicker of hope that she might be warming up to him, even if just a little. Liliana disappeared into the kitchen to find a vase for the flowers, giving James a chance to watch Sophie in relative silence. He noticed how methodically she chose colors, how each crayon stroke seemed deliberate. She had a focus reminiscent of his own, one that both comforted and startled him. Finally, she lifted the paper to show him. "It's a picture of a garden," she announced solemnly, as if unveiling an important masterpiece. He studied the scribbles of green and yellow. "It's beautiful. You're quite the artist, like your mom." A shy smile hinted at the corners of Sophie's mouth. "Mommy paints real good," she said, "when she's not sick." James's chest tightened. "Your mom's going to get better," he said quietly, though a part of him feared he was making a promise he couldn't guarantee. He gently touched the child's shoulder. "We'll make sure of it." Liliana returned, placing the sunflowers on a small table. She sat down heavily on the couch, motioning for James to join her. He complied, the cushions dipping under his weight. The comforting smell of home-cooked food hung in the air, soup or stew, perhaps. He realized he hadn't eaten dinner, but he didn't care. His thoughts were on Liliana's drawn features and Sophie's fragile sense of security. "I start a new round of chemo next week," Liliana said, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "It's going to be rough." She paused, eyes flickering to Sophie. "I'll need help." Without hesitation, James nodded. "I'm here. Whatever it takes." In that moment, he sensed he was stepping irrevocably away from the life he once knew, crossing a threshold toward deeper responsibility. The illusions of invulnerability and boundless corporate ambition slipped away, replaced by a humbling reality. He was a father and an ex-husband to a woman fighting for her life, and no matter the risks to his business, he couldn't walk away from them now. Sunday arrived with a crisp breeze. The sky was startlingly blue, the kind of morning that invited strolls through the park or lazy brunches at neighborhood cafes. Yet James found himself engaged in an entirely foreign routine, helping Liliana pack a small overnight bag for the hospital, She'd already arranged for her friend, Miss Anderson, an elderly neighbor with a calming presence, to watch Sophie while Liliana received treatment. However, James had insisted on assisting too. It felt unnatural to him, stepping so directly into their daily life, but the relief in Liliana's eyes told him it was the right choice. He had never been to this particular hospital before. It was an older building in Brooklyn, far from the state-of-the-art private clinics James typically patronized. The corridors were lined with faded posters about healthy eating and cancer awareness, and the faint odor of antiseptic hung in the air. The whole environment felt simultaneously sterile and overwhelmed, a far cry from the immaculate, high-tech offices where James usually spent his days. At the registration desk, Liliana provided her details while James stood by, feeling strangely useless. A wave of awkwardness rolled over him. He was a billionaire, accustomed to dictating his schedule to an army of assistants, yet he couldn't speed up the paperwork or whisk Liliana to the front of the line. Standing there, it dawned on him how easily money solved so many of life's inconveniences, except, of course, for the ones that mattered most. Once Liliana was settled in a small infusion room, James took a seat beside her. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and a nurse with a gentle smile hooked up an IV line. Liliana's expression remained steady, though a slight tremor in her hand betrayed her nerves. "You can go if you want," she said, glancing his way. "This isn't going to be very pleasant, and it'll be hours before we're done." James folded his arms, shaking his head. "I'm staying. I have my laptop if I need to handle something urgent for work, but I'd rather be here if that's okay with you." She studied him for a moment. "It's okay," she finally replied, voice subdued. "I appreciate it." Their conversation drifted towards simpler topics, like Sophie's favorite bedtime stories and the local deli that made the best chicken soup, comfort talk that skimmed over deeper issues, yet brought a certain warmth. James found himself clinging to this unremarkable chatter, realizing how the most mundane details could mean everything when normalcy was threatened. A few hours later, the nurse returned to check on Liliana. She explained that the treatment would intensify over the coming weeks. Liliana might experience nausea, fatigue, hair loss. James listened intently, taking mental notes as though preparing for a major business deal. But this was different. No matter how meticulously he planned, he couldn't guarantee an outcome. The realization humbled him, a stark reminder that some battles couldn't be won with intellect or wealth alone. He stepped out into the hallway for a short break, retrieving coffee from a vending machine. The lukewarm liquid tasted bitter, but he sipped it anyway, leaning against a wall to gather himself. That was when a cheerful voice reached him. "Mr. Bennett, fancy meeting you here." He turned to see Miss Anderson, wearing a neat cardigan and holding a small bag of groceries. Her silver hair was arranged in a short, practical style, and her smile radiated warmth. "Liliana told me you'd be around," she said. "I just came to drop off some snacks for her. The hospital food can be a bit dull." Despite his usual reserve, James found himself relaxing at Mrs. Anderson's kind demeanor. "That's thoughtful of you," he said. "I'm still new to all this. I had no idea treatment would be so extensive." Miss Anderson's eyes softened. "Cancer doesn't care about convenience, dear. It takes a village sometimes. I'm glad Liliana has people who care about her. For a while, I worried she was trying to handle everything alone." James nodded, recalling how Liliana had managed 4 years of single parenthood. "She's been braver than I ever realized," he admitted. Ms. Anderson patted his arm. "Sophie's a blessing too. That little girl brightens the room wherever she goes. I know this is all new to you, but you're doing just fine. Don't be afraid to learn as you go." Touched by her words, James smiled. It was a peculiar sensation. feeling gratitude for a simple bit of kindness, as if a part of him long dormant was awakening. "Thank you, Miss Anderson," he said softly. "I'm trying." She gave him a nod, then headed to Liliana's room. James lingered, reflecting on how different this environment felt from his plush corporate offices. Yet stepping into this new world, he realized he was beginning to see people in their raw humanity, patients fighting for their lives, loved ones offering support in small but vital ways. By day's end, Liliana finished her first session. She looked drained, dark circles etched under her eyes, but she insisted on walking to the car herself. James offered an arm for support, which she accepted without protest. Guiding her gently into the passenger seat, he climbed behind the wheel. He drove toward her apartment in thoughtful silence, glancing over occasionally to check on her. Outside, the city passed by in a blur of bright lights and busy sidewalks. In that moment, James felt the weight of a quiet resolution settling over him. He was no longer just the powerful CEO forging global deals. He was a man who needed to learn how to be present, how to care, and how to endure. With Liliana resting beside him, he realized that stepping into this new world was as daunting as it was vital. And despite his fears, he wasn't turning back. Over the following days, James found himself navigating routines as alien to him as any foreign culture. Liliana's treatment schedule was erratic. Some mornings, she woke with enough energy to manage small household tasks, while other days, she could barely lift her head. Sophie's emotional needs varied, too. One moment she was a giggling preschooler, excited to show James a new drawing, and the next she seemed withdrawn, sensing her mother's vulnerability. In the midst of it all, James tried to bring a sense of order without imposing his customary rigid style. He quickly learned that small children, especially 4-year-olds, rarely stuck to a perfect timetable. If he arrived to pick Sophie up at her preschool, she might burst into tears because she had just started a craft project and wasn't ready to leave. Or if he promised to read her a bedtime story at 8 o'clock, Liliana's sudden nausea could derail everything. One evening, James arrived at Liliana's apartment to help with dinner. The usual swirl of city traffic hummed outside, headlights streaking across the living room. Inside, he found a half-finished plate of spaghetti on the coffee table, and Liliana slumped on the couch, looking pale and exhausted. Sophie sat beside her, hugging a stuffed bunny. "Mommy doesn't feel good," Sophie explained quietly, her eyes large with concern. "I'm all right," Liliana assured the girl, though her voice sounded hollow. She forced a faint smile at James. "Long day at the hospital. Could you help her get ready for bed?" James's heart twisted at Liliana's fatigue. He gave a reassuring nod. "Of course. I'll take care of it." Sophie stood, still clutching her bunny. James offered her his hand, which she accepted shyly. He felt the light pressure of her tiny fingers and realized how delicate this entire situation was. Together, they walked to her room, a small, cheerful space covered in crayon artwork and stuffed animals. "Do you want to change into your pajamas first?" James asked, trying to remember how his friends with children usually did these things. Sophie nodded. She retrieved a pair of polka dot pajamas from a dresser, then paused. "Mommy usually helps me," she whispered. James took a breath. "I know, she's resting, but I'm here now. We can figure this out together." He helped her unbutton her top and navigate the pajamas. His movements were awkward at first. Sophie giggled when the sleeve got stuck, and James found himself laughing too, grateful for the moment of levity. After she was dressed, he sat with her on the edge of the bed, which was adorned with a soft quilt and a few plush toys. "Which bedtime story do you like?" he asked gently. She pointed to a short stack of picture books on a small shelf. "That one," she decided, picking a colorful volume about a family of bears. He carefully read the story, using different voices for each character. He'd never thought himself capable of such a performance, but seeing Sophie's face light up with every page was surprisingly rewarding. By the time he reached the final line, her eyes were drooping. James set the book aside, tucking her beneath the covers. "Good night, Sophie," he whispered. She yawned, snuggling her bunny close. "Night-night." Then, with her eyes half closed, she added, "Are you going to stay with Mommy?" A soft pang hit him. "Yes," he answered. "I'll make sure she's all right." Sophie nodded, already drifting into sleep. James watched her for a moment, marveling at how trusting she was. A few weeks ago, he hadn't known she existed. Now, he was reading her bedtime stories. He left the room quietly, returning to the living area where Liliana still lay on the couch, eyes closed. She stirred at his approach. "Is she asleep?" He settled onto a chair near her. "Yes, she went to bed without any fuss. We had a little adventure with the pajamas, but we managed." Liliana opened her eyes, gazing at him with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you." James hesitated, searching her face. "How are you feeling?" "Better, now that I'm not on my feet," she murmured, attempting a thin smile. "I can't tell if the chemo is worse on my body or my mind, but either way, it's brutal." A swell of compassion rose within him. "Is there anything else I can do? Cook dinner, pick up more medication, anything?" She shook her head. "You've already done a lot. Just be patient with us, especially with Sophie." "She's scared, though she tries to hide it." James nodded, thinking of the child's anxious eyes. "I will. I promise." Liliana shifted on the couch, exhaling shakily. "I should have told you sooner about her. I was afraid you'd reject us." "Maybe I would have, back then," he admitted quietly, "but not now." She studied him, assessing the sincerity in his gaze. Then she extended a hand, and he took it gently, as if sealing a silent agreement. No further words passed between them, but the moment felt significant. He was adapting, however clumsily, into a new role, a reality that demanded both humility and courage. And for once, the sense of responsibility filling his chest didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the closest thing to purpose he'd ever known. Early the next morning, James realized he needed support beyond Andrew's legal counsel. Parenting and caregiving for Liliana required day-to-day know-how he simply didn't possess. Recalling Miss Anderson's warmth, James decided to visit her for guidance. After dropping Sophie at preschool, he drove a few blocks to Miss Anderson's brownstone, a cozy building on a tree-lined street. The older woman greeted him with a welcoming smile. "Come in, dear." "I was just making tea." In her living room, doilies graced the arms of overstuffed chairs, and family photos lined the mantel. The atmosphere radiated comfort in a way James wasn't used to. He was more familiar with glass desks and abstract art. Yet the moment he sank into one of the chairs, he felt himself relax. Miss Anderson handed him a floral-patterned teacup. "Now, how can I help you today?" James sipped the hot liquid, letting the gentle warmth soothe his nerves. "I'm trying to figure out how to balance everything. Sophie, Liliana's treatments, my company. I've never done this before, and I feel—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Inadequate." Her kind eyes observed him. "No one's born knowing how to be a parent or how to deal with illness. You learn through small steps, mistakes, and forgiveness. If you need practical tips, I can certainly share a few." She proceeded to give him simple but valuable advice. Maintain routines for Sophie. Be patient with her moods, and ensure Liliana got proper nutrition post-chemo. They spoke for nearly an hour, covering everything from bedtime routines to local health resources. At one point, Ms. Anderson patted his hand. "Remember, It's not about perfection. It's about being present, doing your best. James felt an unexpected lump in his throat. "I appreciate your help," he said, voice slightly thick with emotion. "Liliana and Sophie are counting on me." Ms. Anderson's expression turned gentle. "They are, but that doesn't mean you have to face this alone. Your friend Andrew, me, maybe even other parents at Sophie's preschool. We can all be allies if you let us." Realizing how quickly he defaulted to handling problems solo, James nodded. He was used to being the leader, the problem solver. But in this domain, collaboration was not just beneficial, it was necessary. Leaving Miss Anderson's home, James felt a flicker of reassurance. He could do this if he accepted the support of those willing to help. That notion lingered in his mind as he drove to the office, running through a mental checklist of tasks. Amid strategies for corporate growth, he slipped in new personal reminders. Pick up Sophie by 5, call Liliana's oncologist to verify next week's schedule, check if Mrs. Anderson could help on days he had urgent business. Later that afternoon, James met Andrew for lunch at a quiet bistro near the Bennett Tech offices. Over plates of grilled salmon and roasted vegetables, they discussed the looming partnership with Blackwell Industries. Andrew pulled out his tablet, showing the updated terms. "They want a meeting in London next month," he explained, lowering his voice slightly. "A final pitch session, followed by a signing if all goes well." James frowned, mentally juggling the idea of being away for multiple days. "That's not great timing," he muttered. "Liliana's next chemo round might coincide with that." Andrew nodded, understanding the conflict. "You can delegate. Your executives can handle preliminary talks. Then you can join via video conference. But if the London trip is essential, we need a contingency plan for Sophie and Liliana's care." James exhaled slowly. His old self would have jumped on the opportunity to close a multi-billion-dollar partnership. No questions asked. But everything was different now. "I won't risk leaving them stranded," he said firmly. "We'll arrange for Miss Anderson to cover some days, maybe hire a part-time nurse to assist Liliana at home, but I won't be gone for more than a couple of days, tops." Andrew studied him for a moment. "You've changed, James." James managed a small smile. "I'm learning to delegate something more critical than a corporate merger, my personal responsibilities. And surprisingly, I'm okay with it." After lunch, they parted ways. James felt a renewed sense of determination. Allies were emerging in every corner of his life, from Ms. Anderson's gentle mentorship to Andrew's steadfast guidance. Even within his company, several top managers were stepping up, eager to prove they could handle more responsibility. It was as though his shift in priorities had unlocked opportunities for those around him to shine. That evening, James arrived at Liliana's apartment with a sense of purpose. He brought groceries, fresh produce and ingredients for a hearty soup Ms. Anderson had recommended for post-chemo fatigue. He found Liliana resting on the couch and Sophie drawing on the living room floor. "So," he announced gently, "I hear we're in need of some healthy cooking." He set down the bags, pulling out vegetables and broth. Sophie glanced up with bright-eyed interest, while Liliana mustered a grateful nod. As he began chopping carrots under Sophie's watchful gaze, he felt the strangest sensation of belonging. Perhaps for the first time in years, he wasn't orchestrating a boardroom or finalizing a contract. He was simply being present, engaged in an act of care for those who needed him. Surrounded by supportive people, his new allies, he felt the weight of fatherhood and companionship settle into a more natural place in his life. Just when James began to find a fragile equilibrium, the first serious crisis hit. It started with a phone call in the middle of a Wednesday board meeting. Liliana was at the hospital, having collapsed from severe dehydration and fatigue. The second James received the news from Missy, Anderson, he abandoned the meeting, ignoring the startled faces of his colleagues. He rushed to the hospital, heart pounding in a dreadful staccato. In the ER, bright overhead lights reflected off white-tiled floors, amplifying the sense of urgency. He found Liliana in a curtained-off area, an IV attached to her arm. She looked paler than ever, eyes closed, shallow breaths rattling in her chest. A wave of alarm and protectiveness coursed through him. A nurse gently guided James away from the bed. "Sir, we're stabilizing her," she said in a calming tone. "Dehydration and a fever. The chemotherapy has weakened her immune system. We'll need to keep her here for a day or two." James nodded, trying to control the tremor in his voice. "Thank you. Can I stay with her?" "You can stay for now. We'll move her to a private room soon." He remained by Liliana's side, watching her labored breathing, overwhelmed by the stark reminder of how precarious her condition was. Guilt seeped in. He'd been absorbed in bridging fatherhood and business, but he hadn't truly grasped how swiftly her health could deteriorate. Now he was seeing it firsthand. Hours later, when Liliana woke briefly, she found James in the chair beside her, eyes red-rimmed from worry. "Sophie," she murmured, her voice raspy. "She's with Ms. Anderson, safe," James reassured her, leaning in to ensure she heard him. "Take it easy, Liliana. You're in good hands." Her gaze drifted around the sterile environment, realization dawning slowly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. I hate that Sophie sees me like this." "Don't apologize," he said firmly, gently clasping her hand. "This isn't your fault." The next day was a blur of medical updates and quiet vigil. Liliana's fever subsided, but her body remained frail. Meanwhile, Sophie grew anxious at home, missing her mother. James swung between hospital visits and phone calls to Andrew, who offered to handle work emergencies. With each passing hour, the delicate balance James had been trying to maintain threatened to unravel. By late afternoon, James was at Liliana's bedside when his phone buzzed incessantly. It was Catherine Park, the board member who had already questioned his commitment. He sighed, stepping into the corridor to take the call. "James," Catherine said, her voice edged with frustration. "We've got a situation. Blackwell Industries wants a final meeting next week, but they're spooked by your recent absences. They want assurances you're still at the helm, or they may walk." He pressed a hand to his forehead, absorbing the magnitude of the potential fallout. The Blackwell deal was a cornerstone for Bennett Tech Solutions' global expansion, the very thing he'd spent years crafting. Losing it would be a massive blow to the company's future prospects and credibility. "I can do a video conference," he began, eyeing the hospital room where Liliana lay. "I can't travel right now, but..." Catherine cut him off. "They want you in person, no proxies. Their CEO, Conrad Blackwell, sees your absence as a sign of wavering leadership. We're talking billions in investment here. If you aren't there to finalize, I doubt they'll proceed." James swallowed hard, torn between professional ambition and personal crisis. He caught a glimpse of Liliana's sleeping form through the doorway. How could he leave her and Sophie during such a precarious time? And yet, how could he justify walking away from a deal that could transform his company? "I need to think," he said at last, voice clipped. "Well, hurry," Catherine warned. "They're expecting an answer by tomorrow." James ended the call, feeling a surge of anger and desperation. The entire situation reminded him of the old life he'd tried to balance against new obligations. Except now, the stakes were even higher. If he flew to finalize the deal, he'd leave Liliana and Sophie vulnerable. If he refused, the Blackwell partnership might vanish, leaving irreparable damage to his company and to his own legacy in the corporate world. Closing his eyes, he leaned against the cold hospital corridor wall. For the first time, the unstoppable James Bennet felt cornered, facing an obstacle too large to bulldoze. Duty to family collided with duty to shareholders, and he couldn't see a clear path forward. When he returned to Liliana's side, she stirred awake, reading the conflict in his eyes. "Work?" she asked softly. He nodded. "There's a major deal. They want me to fly out next week." She took a shuddering breath, wincing at some internal ache. "James, I know how important your business is. I don't want to keep you from it, but..." She hesitated, tears forming. "I'm so scared." His heart felt as though it was splintering in two. He placed a trembling hand over hers. "I'll figure something out," he whispered, though he had no idea how. In that hospital room, overshadowed by the hiss of medical equipment, James realized he'd encountered his first true test, a conflict where neither choice offered a neat, painless solution. And from the pained look on Liliana's face, he knew that whichever path he took, the consequences would mark them all in ways they would never forget. James lingered in the hospital corridor, feeling the tension knot in his shoulders. Liliana had fallen asleep again, still hooked up to the IV after her sudden collapse. Just 2 doors away, he could hear the distant hum of machinery in the ward, where a handful of patients dozed in their own uneasy rest. Everything about this place, its antiseptic smell, the low overhead lights, reminded him how fragile Liliana's situation was. He glanced at his phone. The moment he'd been dreading had arrived. Catherine Park had messaged, requesting an urgent answer about the Blackwell Industries trip. She claimed the London meeting was set to finalize terms, with Conrad Blackwell himself expecting James's personal involvement. Failure to appear could jeopardize months, maybe years, of negotiations. "James," came a quiet voice from behind. Andrew stood near the door, his expression lined with concern. "How did you know I was here?" James asked. Andrew tapped his phone. "Catherine called me too. She's worried about the deal. I thought you might need an ally." James nodded, relieved by Andrew's presence. Together, they walked a few steps away from Liliana's room for privacy. His voice sounded hollow when he spoke. "You know I can't leave right now. If I vanish for even a few days, Liliana could relapse into another crisis. Sophie's just learning to trust me. How can I abandon her so soon?" Andrew pressed his lips together in thought. "Then maybe we propose a compromise. You can attend via video conference. Insist you'll travel once Liliana is stable. But it won't be easy to convince Blackwell. Their CEO is an old-fashioned type who demands face-to-face negotiation." James ran a hand over his face. "It's not just about him. My board is losing faith. They see me as distracted." He paused, glancing at Liliana's door. "But what choice do I have?" Andrew lifted a shoulder in a subtle shrug. "Not much of one, unless you're willing to risk the deal. Look, let's outline a plan. We'll push for a shorter trip. Maybe you can manage 2 nights in London, no more. You'd leave everything organized for Liliana. Ms. Anderson can stay with her and Sophie. You can hire a part-time nurse." James frowned, his mind reeling. 2 nights. I'd miss at least 1 chemo session. And if something goes wrong... Andrew offered a sympathetic sigh. "You're up against it, my friend. The first test is here. You can't split yourself in 2. A brittle silence stretched between them. Eventually, Andrew gave James a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "I'll handle as much as I can on the legal side. You decide what's best. Just be honest with Liliana." They parted ways, Andrew heading out into the cold afternoon air, while James ducked back into Liliana's room. The beep of her IV pump was the only sound. Liliana stirred, opening her eyes when she sensed James's presence. Her cheeks were drawn, the usual color absent. She exhaled slowly, like every breath took effort. "You should go home and rest," she said. "Sophie's probably worried," James pulled a chair closer to her bedside. Sophie's with Miss Anderson. Don't worry, she's in good hands. He hesitated, forcing himself to address the looming dilemma. Listen, there's a critical meeting in London next week. If I don't go, there's a high chance the Blackwell deal will fall apart. Liliana watched him with a guarded expression. That deal, you've been working on it for over a year, right? He nodded, feeling the pang of responsibility in his chest. Yes, it's massive. But if I leave, even for 2 days, what happens if you need me? She let her gaze flick to the IV stand, the slow drip of medication a reminder of her ongoing battle. We'll manage. I'll have Miss Anderson. And if you hire a nurse to stay here, I'll be fine. Don't throw away everything you've built just because I got sick. James leaned forward. It's not just about the company. It's about being a decent human being. I haven't always been there for you. It's okay, Liliana cut in, her voice taut with emotion. You're here now. That means something. He blinked, wrestling the surge of conflicting emotions. Once, he would have seized any chance to secure a major deal. Now, he felt an equal pull toward his family. Both paths, in their own way, tested him. Finally, he reached for her hand, mindful of the IV line taped to her arm. If you say you'll be all right, I'll go. But I promise, I'll keep the trip as short as possible. The moment the meeting's over, I'll come back. Liliana's fingers curled around his, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. That's all I ask. Exhaustion overcame her, and she closed her eyes again. James listened to her breathing, the rhythmic beep of the monitor, and let the decision settle in his mind. He'd do what was necessary to preserve the deal briefly, yet return in a heartbeat if needed. This was his test. To bend without breaking, to prove he could juggle both roles. Despite his trembling uncertainty, he resolved to try. In the ensuing days, James worked feverishly to set up a support network for Liliana and Sophie. He poured resources into hiring an experienced home nurse, Marcia Greenfield, a middle-aged woman with a soothing voice and a calm demeanor. Mrs. Anderson kindly agreed to fill any gaps in childcare. She was retired, after all, and had a soft spot for Sophie. Meanwhile, Andrew handled the legalities behind the scenes, quickly drafting short-term care documents that would allow James to make medical decisions on Liliana's behalf if her condition worsened. It wasn't a full custody arrangement, but it offered a level of security. James felt a tinge of relief having a plan in place, though a part of him cringed at how formal it all sounded. On a crisp afternoon before his flight, he picked Sophie up from preschool. She trotted to him, pigtails bouncing, hugging her bunny tightly. "Hi," she said, voice shy but warming up with familiarity. James held out his hand, guiding her to the car. "How was your day?" "I painted a unicorn," she replied with a proud tilt of her chin. "Can I show you?" "Absolutely," he assured, suppressing the swirl of anxiety about leaving for London. He forced himself to focus on Sophie, to relish the ordinary conversation. Once they arrived at Liliana's apartment, Sophie darted inside, rummaging through her backpack for the painting. James found Liliana dozing on the couch, looking fragile but composed enough to greet him with a small smile. Marcia, the nurse, stood watchfully by, offering James a polite nod. "Her fever's down," Marcia reported softly. "She has more energy today." "That's good," he replied, inhaling a quiet sense of relief. After exchanging a few more details, Marcia left James and Liliana alone in the living room. Liliana watched him remove his coat, her gaze sweeping over his expensive suit. "When do you leave?" "First thing in the morning," he said, tugging at his tie. "Flight's at 6. I'll be in London for 2 nights, maybe 3 if negotiations drag out." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "Thank you for arranging everything. "Marcia, Ms. Anderson, I know it must cost a small fortune." He offered a small shrug. "Money's not the issue. I just want to be sure you're safe." Liliana seemed ready to say more, but Sophie bounded into the room, waving a painting covered in bold colors. A rainbow arched over a gleeful unicorn with a crooked horn. James crouched down to admire it, sensing Liliana's gaze on them. "This is amazing," he said, ruffling Sophie's hair gently. Sophie smiled wide. "Mommy likes it too. I'm going to put it on the fridge." Liliana mustered a gentle grin. "We're running out of space, but we'll make room." The moment filled James with a sense of simple joy, yet it also reminded him of what he stood to lose if he mishandled the balance between family and business. Exhaustion weighed on him, heavier than any corporate pressure he'd known. He realized he was fighting two wars, one to keep his company on track and another to ensure his family didn't slip through the cracks. Later that evening, after putting Sophie to bed, James hovered by Liliana's bedroom door. She looked up from the pillows. A soft lamp cast shadows across her pale features, highlighting the worry etched in her eyes. "I hate that you have to go," she admitted, voice trembling just a little. He stepped closer, heart twisting with guilt. "I promise I'll make it quick. If something happens—" "I know," she interrupted gently. "You'll come back." "I believe you." Her quiet confidence was both reassuring and heartbreaking. James reached out, briefly brushing the back of his hand against her cheek. "Get some rest," he said, voice hushed. Liliana nodded, her eyes glinting with unshed tears. She didn't voice the obvious fear that her health might decline and he wouldn't be there to hold things together. Just before leaving, James found Marcia in the living room, flipping through a medical chart. "If anything changes, anything at all, you call me immediately," he instructed, scribbling down the name of his London hotel and his personal cell number. "Time difference or not, I'll answer." Marcia placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Liliana's in good hands, Mr. Bennett. You do what you must for your work, and we'll handle things here." He tried to believe her words, yet a swirl of dread persisted in his stomach. Driving back to his penthouse, he mulled over the next few days. Powerful business executives in polished conference rooms, Conrad Blackwell's penetrating stare as they hammered out final terms. James realized that while he might close the deal, an invisible clock would tick in the back of his mind every second he was away from Liliana and Sophie. That night, he tossed and turned, caught in an internal battle. Had he changed enough to truly balance these responsibilities? Or was he simply fooling himself, thinking he could juggle a crucial negotiation while his ex-wife battled cancer and a 4-year-old daughter waited for him to come home? Unable to quell the anxiety, he rose before dawn, dressed in a crisp suit, and boarded the flight, hoping in that fragile dawn light he was making the right decision. Landing in London felt surreal. The bustling Heathrow terminal, with its barrage of announcements and rushing travelers, provided a stark contrast to the quiet hospital corridors he'd left behind. James had reserved a luxury suite at a 5-star hotel, standard procedure for a man of his position, but the grandeur did nothing to ease his mind. Every time he checked his phone, he half expected a message from Marcia or Miss Anderson bearing dire news. Day 1 of negotiations with Conrad Blackwell proved more challenging than expected. Gathered in a sleek conference room on the 40th floor of a modern high-rise, James found himself seated across from a tall, silver-haired gentleman with incisive blue eyes that seemed to appraise every nuance. "As we finalize this merger," Conrad began, adjusting his gold cufflinks, "we need your unwavering commitment, Bennett Tech Solutions included. The global market is volatile, and we must move decisively." James nodded, trying to match the man's intense demeanor. Yet, each statement brought an edge of tension. Conrad pressed for deeper integration than initially agreed, aiming to restructure certain departments within Bennett Tech Solutions. James sensed that Conrad aimed to exploit any sign of weakness. Perhaps he'd heard rumors that James was distracted by personal matters. They broke for lunch, and James stepped into the corridor, phone already in hand. A few missed calls flashed on the screen, and his heart lurched. He dialed Marcia immediately, ducking into a private alcove. "Mr. Bennett," Marcia greeted. Her voice carried a note of fatigue. "Liliana's coping all right, but she's had more severe nausea today. Sophie's worried. She cried for you this morning, asking when you'd be back." A pang of guilt struck him. "Is Liliana stable?" "Yes, for the moment." James closed his eyes, relief and regret warring inside him. "Keep me updated on every development. I'll fly out as soon as we wrap here." He ended the call, shoulders sagging. Even from thousands of miles away, the weight of responsibility pressed down, reminding him that no matter how adept he was at business, illness and a child's fears were not so easily contained. That afternoon, negotiations took a turn for the worse. Conrad demanded a final signing by the next day, pushing an accelerated timeline. "We can't afford delays," he said. "If you need more time, perhaps this partnership isn't as beneficial as we thought." James's composure nearly cracked. He steeled himself, explaining that he needed at least an extra day to finalize certain points with his board. Conrad's expression hardened. "We expected you to come here with all your board's mandates in hand," Conrad countered. "Is there a reason for the hold-up?" James forced a taut smile. "No reason at all, just standard procedure." But inside he felt battered. The fear of losing the deal clashed brutally with the image of Sophie asking for him at home. By the time he returned to his hotel that evening, he felt worn down to the core. Hunched over a laptop in the suite's living area, he typed frantic emails to Andrew and his board, trying to sort out last-minute legalities before morning arrived. At one point, the phone rang. Marcia again. She spoke in hushed tones. "Liliana's having a rough night, sir. She's extremely weak. I'm considering taking her back to the hospital if her vitals drop any further." James gripped the edge of the desk. "Tell her I'll be home soon, tomorrow if possible. I'd just keep her stable, please." He ended the call feeling helpless. Never had he resented his role as a CEO quite as much as he did in that moment. The walls of the opulent suite seemed to close in. Guilt gnawed at him. He had once prided himself on compartmentalization, on sealing away personal concerns while forging success. Now he realized that approach was failing him. Life refused to be boxed neatly in separate corners. Late that night, he paced the room, mind racing. Sophie needed him. Liliana might need hospitalization. And Conrad Blackwell expected James to finalize a multi-billion-dollar partnership by sunrise. An excruciating dilemma formed. Walk away from the deal, to rush home, or stay just a bit longer, potentially losing precious time if Liliana's condition worsened. Wearily, he sank into the sofa, loosening his tie. If he lost the partnership, the board might lose faith in him altogether. The company could take a massive financial hit. But if he lost Liliana, or if she deteriorated while he was gone, the toll would be immeasurable, and not in dollars and cents. Clenching his jaw, James made a decision he'd never imagined making before. He would do whatever it took to secure the final signature by morning, no matter how long the night. After that, he would be on the next flight back, even if it meant leaving the board to handle any aftermath. Right now, each hour felt like an enemy, ticking away possibilities for Liliana's recovery. As much as he hated playing into Conrad's pressured timeline, returning to New York was all that truly mattered. The following day began with an early breakfast meeting in Conrad Blackwell's executive suite. The morning sky was still tinged with pale gray when James arrived. He forced himself to project composure, a crisp suit and unwavering gaze, hiding the restless night he'd just endured. Conrad eyed him with caution, as though gauging if James was truly up for the final push. "All right, Bennett," he said, tapping a thick contract folder. "We've made our positions clear. Are you prepared to sign on behalf of Bennett Tech Solutions today?" James's response carried a quiet resolve. "Yes, provided you honor the terms we negotiated last night." A tension-laden negotiation ensued. The two men and their respective teams refined contract language, sparred over closing clauses, and hammered out concessions. By midday, the final agreement reached James's laptop for an electronic signature, then Conrad's. The hush in the room as each line was initialed seemed to reverberate with the magnitude of what they were sealing. This merger would reshape James's empire, unlocking new international markets and guaranteeing massive returns for shareholders. Yet, while Conrad's face broke into a triumphant grin at the final handshake, James felt no sense of triumph. He shook the older man's hand firmly, ignoring the flutter of anxiety still lodged in his gut. "I have to get home," he thought. "You did well," Conrad remarked, his tone laced with a hint of admiration. "Despite your distractions, you're a formidable negotiator." James offered a nod, too drained for false pleasantries. "Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to catch a flight." He left the conference room with quick strides, instructing his team to handle any remaining formalities. Catherine Park tried to stop him for a final debrief, but he waved her off politely. "Have Andrew loop me in," he said in a tight voice. "I'm done here." Within 2 hours, James was on a plane bound for New York. Tension roiled in his chest the entire flight. He checked his phone obsessively for updates. Spotty internet at 30,000 feet made it maddeningly difficult to stay informed. The moment they landed at JFK, he powered his phone back on, heart pounding. A single text appeared from Marcia. "Vitals stable, but she's admitted again to the hospital." James felt the seats and travelers around him fade into background noise. Liliana was back in the hospital. As the plane taxied to the gate, he hammered out a quick reply, promising to arrive as soon as possible. The only flicker of solace was the word stable. Still, he couldn't banish the mental image of Liliana's pale face. The drive from the airport to the hospital felt interminable. Each red light drove him to white-knuckled impatience. By the time he arrived at the emergency entrance, night had fallen. He raced inside, scanning for any sign of Marcia or Miss Anderson. A nurse finally directed him to Liliana's room. There, he found Miss Anderson sitting in a stiff plastic chair, reading to Sophie in hushed tones. Sophie clutched her bunny, eyes wet with tears. The child turned at the sound of footsteps, and seeing James, she stood, face crumpling in a fresh wave of emotion. "Where were you?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Mommy was so sick." James felt the sting of guilt like a punch. He crouched down and gathered her into a gentle hug. "I'm sorry, I had to go away for work, but I'm here now." Sophie's arms clung to his shoulders, and he sensed the depth of her fear. "Ms. Anderson quietly patted the girl's back, her own eyes reflecting sympathy. "She was brave," Ms. Anderson murmured, "but it's been a rough day." Liliana was vomiting so much she became dehydrated again. James forced himself to stand, crossing the room to the bed where Liliana lay. She looked frail, eyes half-lidded, an IV in her arm. The rhythmic beep of a heart monitor punctuated the silence. Her eyelids fluttered open at his approach. "You're here," she whispered, voice raspy. He drew closer, forcing a smile. "I got the deal done, and I came straight back. How are you feeling?" Her breath came slow and shallow. "Like I've been run over by a truck," she admitted, attempting a weak grin. "But they gave me meds to stop the nausea." A rush of conflicting emotions washed over James. Relief that she was stable, remorse that he'd left in the first place, and a swirl of fatigue from the relentless pressure he'd been under. He slipped his hand into hers. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said softly. "It's okay," she replied, though her eyes glimmered with the sadness of someone who'd felt alone when she needed comfort most. At least Sophie was here. Ms. Anderson, too. He nodded, guilt stabbing deeper. He'd achieved a milestone for his company, but at the cost of leaving Liliana in her darkest hour. Kneeling by her bed, he pressed his forehead briefly against the back of her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin. For a moment, the victory of signing a historic merger felt hollow. What was another $1 billion compared to the weight of Liliana's pain and Sophie's tears? He remembered Conrad's approving handshake, the adrenaline of sealing the deal. Now none of that could match the simple act of being present for someone he loved. The contrast between boardroom success and human need had never felt so stark or so devastatingly real. The hospital room became a home base for James over the next few days. He managed phone calls and email updates from the hallway, refusing to stray far from Liliana's side. Nurses came and went with fresh IVs, checking vitals, adjusting medication. Sophie spent her hours drawing pictures on a small table set up near the bed, alternating between crayons and worried glances at her mother. One afternoon, Liliana dozed fitfully while Sophie napped on a makeshift cot by the window. Andrew arrived, balancing 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to James, motioning for them to step into the corridor. "Thought you might need a pick-me-up," he whispered. James took a grateful sip, feeling the jolt of caffeine. His exhaustion was bone deep, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave, not even for a proper meal. "Thanks," he murmured, leaning against the wall. "I feel like I'm juggling a dozen knives. The deal's technically signed, but the follow-up details are piling up, and I can't be in the office. Liliana's still so weak." Andrew tilted his head, sympathy written on his features. "The board understands to a point. You've secured the partnership. That buys you some credibility, but they want reassurance you'll be back soon. There's talk of a shareholders' conference." James fought back a wave of frustration. "A shareholders' conference now? I can't leave Liliana alone. She's had 2 emergency hospital visits in the last week." Andrew patted his shoulder. "We can postpone a formal conference, but not forever. The new Blackwell-Bennett merger is big news. Stakeholders are demanding to know the company's direction. We need a strategic rollout plan." James scrubbed a hand over his tired face. "I get it, but Liliana's priority. End of story." He paused, remembering Sophie's anxious eyes every time he left the room for more than a few minutes. "I won't abandon them again." Andrew studied him for a moment, a flicker of approval in his gaze. "No one's asking you to. We'll figure out a compromise. The big question is, how do we manage your time without letting either side slip, your family or your corporation?" James swallowed, appreciating Andrew's candor. "I don't know yet," he confessed. "I'm running on adrenaline, a single crisis, and I'm undone." Andrew set his coffee cup on a nearby ledge. "Then maybe it's time you delegate more authority within the company. Catherine Park and the others can handle day-to-day decisions while you focus here. At least until Liliana is stable." Though it pained James to relinquish that much control, the logic was undeniable. "I might have to," he conceded. "I just hope the board doesn't see it as weakness." A corner of Andrew's mouth lifted. "I think you'll be surprised. People appreciate a CEO who values humanity. You closed the biggest deal in the company's history. Nobody can question your commitment to success. Now show them your commitment extends to something beyond the bottom line." James inhaled slowly, letting Andrew's words settle. The weight on his shoulders felt no lighter, but a sense of clarity bloomed. He needed to reorganize responsibilities, trusting his carefully chosen executives. Perhaps, in doing so, he could be the father and friend Liliana and Sophie needed without torpedoing the business he'd spent years building. They re-entered Liliana's room, where Miss Anderson was quietly tidying up a tray of half-eaten hospital food. Sophie stirred, blinking sleep from her eyes, and Liliana also roused. Andrew offered them all a gentle wave. "I'll leave you to rest," he said, stepping out discreetly. Liliana turned her head toward James, her voice subdued. "Everything okay?" He mustered a reassuring smile. "Yes, just company matters. Andrew's taking the lead so I can stay here." She reached out, and he took her hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "You don't have to do that," she murmured. "What if they see it as negligence?" "Let them," James said. "I'm not leaving you right now." A fragile look of gratitude crossed her face. "I spent so long sure that you'd always pick work. But you didn't. Thank you." Sophie sat up, wiping her eyes. "Is Mommy better?" she asked in a small voice. James crouched by her, gently brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "She's getting there. We just have to be patient and help her stay strong." The girl nodded, hugging her bunny. "Okay." In that small room, James felt the escalating pressure more acutely than ever. The next phase of Liliana's treatment loomed, an even harsher round of chemotherapy. The newly minted partnership with Blackwell demanded strategic oversight. Sophie needed a steady father figure. He could sense a climactic trial forming on the horizon, something that would demand every ounce of commitment and courage he had left. Yet, for the first time, he believed he might endure whatever was coming. Not because of his business acumen, but because he finally understood that real success meant standing by the people you care about, no matter how daunting the challenge. As he gently squeezed Liliana's hand, feeling Sophie's small shoulder lean against him, he braced himself for the central test. It was no longer about conquering the business world alone. It was about conquering his own fear of losing what truly mattered and discovering if he had the strength to save it. For several weeks, James maintained a delicate balancing act that tested him in every conceivable way. Liliana had settled into a private room at the hospital for her next round of chemotherapy. Sophie split her time between Miss Anderson's comforting brownstone and the hospital's waiting area, coloring pictures or watching cartoons on a tablet. Meanwhile, Bennett Tech Solutions was transitioning into the newly formed Blackwell-Bennett partnership, demanding near-constant oversight. Despite the relentless strain, James held steady until a grave setback struck without warning. Late one evening, Liliana's doctor summoned him for an urgent conversation. A petite woman in her early 50s, Dr. Nguyen, guided James into a dimly lit consultation room, her expression grave. "We've detected some abnormalities in Liliana's recent scans," Dr. Nguyen explained, pointing to images on a monitor. "The cancer cells are proving more aggressive than we initially thought. We need to escalate her treatment, possibly moving to a more experimental protocol." The news landed like a punch to his gut. Experimental, meaning there are no guarantees it'll work. The doctor nodded gently. "There are always risks, but waiting could be even more dangerous. Her next rounds will be more taxing. She'll need significant support, physically, emotionally, financially." James felt his throat tighten. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what you need." "It won't just be about money," Dr. Nguyen cautioned. "She'll need round-the-clock care, unwavering encouragement. The stress on both of you, on Sophie's too, will be substantial." That night, he sat at Liliana's bedside, watching her sleep. The rhythmic whir of the IV pump underscored the magnitude of the decision before them. He weighed the concept of experimental treatment knowing full well that it could offer hope or heartbreak. If he encouraged Liliana to proceed and the side effects proved devastating, how would he live with that? Yet if they did nothing, her prognosis could worsen more rapidly. When Liliana stirred, he swallowed hard and explained the situation in hushed tones. She listened, absorbing the news calmly, despite the fear flickering in her eyes. "It's your call," James concluded, voice trembling at the edges. "But whatever you decide, I'm with you." Liliana's gaze dropped to the thin blanket covering her legs. "I want to try," she whispered. "If there's even a chance this can buy me more time with Sophie, with you." She trailed off, her cheeks flushed with both emotion and exhaustion. James placed a hand over hers, ignoring the tangle of IV tubes. "Then we'll fight," he said, mustering as much confidence as he could. "No matter what it takes." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Marcia, the home nurse now practically living at Liliana's side, stepped in. She carried a small teddy bear that Sophie had dropped off earlier, its stuffed arms outstretched in a perpetual hug. "She wanted to make sure her mom had this," Marcia said gently, setting the bear on the bed. Liliana's eyes misted over. "She's so worried." James looked from the teddy bear to Liliana's face, sorrow slicing through him. "She's a brave kid," he murmured, "but she needs you, Lil." A wave of vulnerability passed between them. For the first time since their divorce, they let the walls fall away. James reached out, cupping Liliana's chin tenderly. He saw the traces of the vibrant woman he once loved, now tempered by suffering. And in her eyes, he recognized a profound resolve. She wasn't ready to give up, not on life, and not on this budding second chance between them. Stepping out into the corridor, James braced himself for a different confrontation. He dialed Andrew to confirm the next steps in the Blackwell-Bennett transition. In a measured tone, James laid out his position. "I'm shifting more day-to-day oversight to Catherine Park and the other board members. Liliana's treatment escalates tomorrow. I won't be in the office for a while." Andrew's reply carried a subdued mix of concern and approval. "We'll manage, James. Just do what you have to do." Hanging up, James felt a surge of contradictory emotions: fear, guilt, and fierce determination. If the supreme ordeal was truly upon them, he would face it head-on. For all his corporate mastery, this was a battle that demanded more than any business strategy. Love, hope, and a willingness to share Liliana's burden would be his only weapons. He returned to the room, heart pounding, finding Liliana awake and reaching for the teddy bear. He eased onto the bed's edge, taking her hand once more. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "we face it together." And in her tired smile, he saw quiet acceptance of the war they were about to wage, a war with no guarantee of victory, but the highest stakes he had ever known. The following day brought a flurry of activity. Doctors, nurses, and specialists converged to discuss Liliana's new treatment protocol. James observed from a corner of the room, feeling both helpless and determined. An experimental drug regimen would begin that afternoon, featuring potent chemicals meant to attack the cancer cells more aggressively. The side effects, however, promised to be severe. Outside in the hallway, Sophie clung to Miss Anderson's hand. The little girl had drawn a bright rainbow across her forearm with markers, a childish attempt to bring color into the solemn environment. Catching James's eye, Ms. Anderson guided Sophie over, sensing he might need a comforting presence. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" Sophie asked quietly, wide green eyes brimming with tears she tried to hold back. Kneeling down, James gently stroked her hair. "We're doing everything we can, sweetie. She's got the best doctors." He glanced up at Miss Anderson, who offered a firm nod of encouragement. Yet, as soon as Sophie returned to a nearby waiting area, James retreated to a window overlooking the hospital courtyard. His reflection stared back, pale and drawn, an unfamiliar version of himself. He thought about the unstoppable magnate he'd been not so long ago, a man who rarely yielded to sentiment. Now, love and vulnerability had pried him open, forcing him to confront a world he couldn't control. Andrew arrived shortly after, carrying a folder stuffed with financial projections. They found a secluded bench near an elevator bank, away from the constant beeping of monitors. Andrew sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. The board is anxious, but supportive. For now, they recognize your personal circumstances. James nodded, glancing at the folder. Any updates on the Blackwell deal fallout? The merger is still moving ahead, but there's a catch. Blackwell Industries wants immediate structural changes in your management teams, faster than we anticipated. They claim that since you're, well, distracted, your team needs to step up. Catherine Park is the top candidate for interim leadership. Despite everything happening with Liliana, James felt a flash of tension. They're trying to force my hand. Andrew held his gaze. They see an opening. Doesn't mean they'll oust you, but they want more control during your absence. It's the price they're naming. James expelled a slow breath, staring at the stark hospital walls. He wondered if he cared as much as he once did. On one hand, giving up even partial control of Bennett Tech Solutions had once been an unthinkable betrayal of his ambition. On the other, none of those ambitions seemed to matter more than the potential loss of Liliana. He rubbed his forehead, a dull ache forming. "All right," he said at length. "Tell them I'll agree to an interim arrangement. Catherine can handle operations. I'm staying with Liliana." Andrew's eyes flickered with concern. "That's a big concession. Are you sure?" James nodded firmly. "I am. I won't split my focus right now." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the hum of hospital machinery reverberating in the distance. Then Andrew shifted closer, voice low. "James, you're making the right choice for Liliana and Sophie, but you need to prepare for the corporate ramifications. Some board members might try to capitalize on your absence. You may not return to the exact position you left." Staring at a passing nurse pushing a supply cart, James felt a strange calm wash over him. Then so be it. The old me would have seen that as a catastrophe, but I understand now that certain things can't wait. Andrew patted his shoulder sympathetically. "All right. Let's finalize it." When Andrew departed, James lingered on the bench, letting the swirl of hospital life drift around him. Doctors rushed by with clipboards. Families spoke in hushed tones. Everyone carried their own burden, and in this environment, money and status meant little. An hour later, as Liliana's first dose of the experimental therapy began, James stood at her side. She gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes screwed shut against the pain. The beep of the IV pump sounded sinister, each drip injecting an uncertain future into her veins. "This is just the start," she groaned, turning her face into the pillow. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I know. We'll take it minute by minute." Her labored breathing hitched as nausea washed over her. James urged a nurse to bring another basin, the reality of the side effects already sinking in. Whatever sacrifices he had made, his authority at Bennett Tech, his unflinching corporate persona, felt trivial in the face of her anguish. "You're not alone," he whispered, feeling her tremble under his touch. "I'm here." As the treatment coursed through Liliana's body, James understood that they were paying a steep price for every chance at survival. His career ambitions stood in limbo, and Liliana's physical and emotional reserves were pushed to the edge, but neither relinquished hope. The cost, though daunting, was one they had chosen to bear, together. Hours blurred into days, and days into a strange continuum of hospital routines. Liliana's experimental chemotherapy hammered her system, triggering debilitating waves of nausea and weakness. At times, she could barely keep her eyes open. Other moments, she drifted in and out of a restless sleep, murmuring Sophie's name or flinching at nightmares born from the potent drugs. James took on a role he'd never pictured: caretaker. He was the one holding her hand through dizzy spells, pressing cool cloths to her forehead and coaxing her to take sips of water. Though he remained vigilant in overseeing the newly formed Blackwell-Bennett transition from afar, brief nightly calls with Catherine Park, sporadic email checks, his true focus was Liliana. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the skyline visible through the hospital window, Liliana stirred from a shallow doze. James helped her shift upright, adjusting the pillows. She looked down at her hands, which trembled slightly. "I feel like I'm fading," she whispered, her voice raw. "I hate that Sophie sees me like this." "She's coping," James reassured her. "She's being looked after by Mrs. Anderson, and I visit her whenever I can. She understands you're fighting to get better." Liliana closed her eyes. "I just can't let go of the guilt. Leaving her alone all these years. I was so sure you'd never choose us. Now I worry I took away her chance at having a father earlier." A melancholy hush filled the room. James placed a careful hand over hers, feeling her fragile bones beneath the skin. "I wasn't ready then," he admitted, voice hushed. "You and Sophie deserved better than the man I used to be." Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. "But maybe I should have given you the choice." The unspoken regrets lingered between them, a testament to years lost to pride and misunderstandings. Yet beneath the sorrow, James sensed a new closeness forming. That unbreakable wall between them had been dismantled, replaced with mutual humility and an unspoken longing to rewrite their painful history, even if only in the present. Later that night, James stepped into the hallway to find Sophie curled up in a plastic waiting room chair, coloring with Ms. Anderson's watchful presence nearby. The child spotted him and hurried over, pressing a drawing into his hand. It showed 3 stick figures, Sophie, James, and Liliana, holding hands under a big yellow sun. In Sophie's childlike scrawl, the words, "We love Mommy," curved above their heads. James's throat tightened. "This is beautiful, sweetheart." "Let's show it to her." Sophie looked uncertain. "Do you think it'll make her happy?" He bent down, brushing a tender hand across her hair. "I think it'll mean everything to her." They entered Liliana's room quietly. She was awake, sipping water through a straw, her weary eyes lighting up when she saw Sophie. The little girl approached with bashful affection, extending the drawing. "Mommy, I made this," Sophie murmured, blinking hard to keep her tears in check. Liliana studied the picture, her own eyes brimming. "Sophie, it's perfect." Her voice trembled as she drew Sophie closer. James couldn't recall a moment that felt so intimate, so reflective of the family they could have been long ago, and the one they might still be forging now. In that silent exchange, something fundamental shifted in James's heart. Where once he'd relied on power and wealth to define him, he now felt an anchor in simple acts of love. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was subtle, an unfolding clarity that seeped through his defenses. He found himself stepping forward. Quietly, he suggested that Sophie sing a lullaby she'd learned in preschool. At first, the girl hesitated, glancing at her mother's frail form, but with a gentle nod from Liliana, Sophie began a soft tune, her voice trembling but sincere. As the melody drifted through the sterile air, James blinked back moisture in his eyes. He realized that all the grand corporate conquests he'd achieved paled in comparison to this scene, a child serenading her mother, forging a fragile hope in the face of mortal struggle. Liliana's gaze met James's across the bed rails. Though pain etched her features, a glimmer of peace radiated in her eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that this closeness, this unity, was healing them in ways medicine alone could not. In that moment, James discovered a new depth to love. Love that could thrive in hospital hallways, blossoming even amid exhaustion and fear. And in embracing that love, he felt his own transformation solidify, piece by piece. His empire might shift in uncertain ways, but the empire of his heart was quietly, powerfully expanding. Late one afternoon, Dr. Nguyen requested a private meeting with James, citing important updates on Liliana's prognosis. James's pulse quickened as he followed her down a corridor and into a small consultation room. Rows of medical charts lined the walls, and a faint hum came from the overhead lighting. Dr. Nguyen tapped the top file. "We've run some additional tests. The experimental regimen has had mixed results so far. Some cancer markers are down, which is promising, but her body is under immense strain. We may need a crucial surgical intervention soon." James's heart hammered. "Surgery? You mentioned that was a last resort." She nodded gravely. "It is, but if the chemo continues without surgical removal of certain compromised tissues, her chances may not improve further. This operation will be risky, especially given her weakened state, yet it could be her best shot." He swallowed. "Have you told Liliana?" "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. She's emotionally vulnerable, and I need her as calm and supported as possible. You've been a stabilizing force. She trusts you." In that moment, James felt the familiar sense of responsibility clamp down on him, but in a context that dwarfed any corporate crisis. "I'll talk to her," he said solemnly. "We'll figure it out together." Returning to Liliana's room, James found her propped up on pillows, absently scrolling through pictures on her phone. Photos of Sophie as a toddler, covered in finger paint. She glanced up, noticing his worried expression. "Bad news?" James settled in the chair beside her. "It's more of a crossroads than bad news. Dr. Nguyen says your tumor markers are responding to the chemo in some ways, but there's a possibility you'll need surgery. A big one." Liliana's eyes flickered with anxiety. "Surgery? I thought we were hoping the chemo alone could do it." "That was the hope," James conceded, "but if removing the affected tissue gives you a better chance, maybe we should consider it." He hesitated, voice growing thick. "But it comes with risks, Lil." She stared at her hands, silent for several moments. "I'm so tired," she confessed eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of fighting, tired of hurting. But if there's a chance—" James caught her trembling hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I'll be here. Whatever it takes, I'll be right here." The days that followed turned into a flurry of preparations. Dr. Nguyen organized a surgical team, scheduling Liliana for a thorough pre-op evaluation. James coordinated everything outside the hospital. He placed Mrs. Anderson on standby to watch Sophie around the clock, ensured Marcia would remain at Liliana's side, and delegated further corporate duties to Catherine and the board. Andrew showed up with new legal documents, an updated healthcare power of attorney that gave James clear authority to make critical decisions if Liliana was incapacitated during the operation. James signed them solemnly, each stroke of the pen a reminder of how fragile life could be. The night before the surgery, Liliana's nerves flared. She lay in bed, IV lines snaking around her arms, while James massaged her shoulders in gentle, circular motions. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, voice choking with emotion. He paused. "What do you mean?" Her eyes glistened. "For everything that happened before, how we drifted apart, how I took Sophie away. I never intended to hurt you so deeply. I was angry, and I thought you didn't care, but you did in your own way, even if it wasn't the way I needed." James felt tears threaten at the corners of his eyes. "I was too consumed by work. I should have shown you I cared. Maybe we could have avoided so much pain." She reached up, brushing her palm against his cheek, where stubble hinted at sleepless nights. "We can't change the past, but maybe we can shape what comes next." Bending down, James pressed his forehead to hers, inhaling the quiet intimacy of the moment. Gone were the days of grand gestures or romantic illusions. All that remained was a raw, powerful bond forged in crisis. "We'll shape it together," he whispered. Their conversation gave way to silence as the gravity of the impending surgery settled over them. Outside the window, the city lights glimmered like distant stars, echoing a sense of fragile hope. James helped Liliana into a more comfortable position, then sat watch at her bedside, refusing to leave her alone. With morning closing in, both of them drifted into a restless doze. Tomorrow's operation loomed as the final test of their resilience, the supreme ordeal that would either break them or grant them a fighting chance at a future they'd only dared to imagine in quiet moments. And James, for all his worldly success, found that he had never been more terrified or more ready to protect the woman he loved. Dawn arrived in a pale wash of light that crept through the hospital windows. Nurses began their rounds, adjusting IV drips and distributing medication trays. Liliana's surgery was scheduled for mid-morning, and a heavy hush settled over her room. Sophie was with Ms. Anderson down the hall, coloring another picture as she waited. James stood at Liliana's side, the antiseptic scent of the hospital now so familiar it no longer registered. Her face looked calm, yet resolute. She wore a thin hospital gown, her dark hair tied back in a low ponytail. Traces of fear lingered in her eyes, but she forced a brave smile when she met his gaze. A surgical resident arrived, pushing a gurney. "We'll transport you to the OR in a few minutes," she said, offering a sympathetic glance. "The anesthesiologist will meet you there." Liliana glanced at James, her voice trembling. "Stay with me until they take me in." He took her hand, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I'm not going anywhere." They rolled Liliana through the corridors, fluorescent lights streaking overhead like a tunnel. The operating room's heavy double doors finally loomed into view. Here, James had to pause. Family members weren't allowed beyond this point. An OR nurse approached, gently positioning Liliana's bed for transfer. Leaning down, James pressed a soft kiss to Liliana's forehead. "I'll be right here when you get out," he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. She reached up, cupping his cheek for a brief moment. "No matter what happens," she managed, "thank you for coming back to us." Her words struck him like a tidal wave. He clenched her hand one last time, then let the nurse guide her away. As she disappeared through the swinging doors, James felt time itself halt, his heart pounding in the vacuum left behind. A waiting room down the hall offered plastic chairs and a TV broadcasting daytime talk shows. He barely noticed them. Andrew arrived soon after, suit jacket slung over one arm, carrying coffee in a paper cup. He handed the cup to James, who accepted it mechanically, not sure if he'd even sip it. "How long do they expect the surgery to last?" Andrew asked in a low tone, settling into the chair beside him. 3, maybe 4 hours, if there are no complications," James replied, eyes glued to the swinging doors. Andrew nodded, gently clapping a hand on James's shoulder. "She's strong, James. You both are." Minutes stretched into hours. Ms. Anderson brought Sophie briefly to see James, but sensing the tension, Sophie soon retreated to a quieter corner where Ms. Anderson read her a storybook. Occasionally, doctors, nurses, or orderlies passed by, and each time James perked up, hoping for news. None came. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Nguyen emerged, peeling off a surgical cap. Her expression was guarded, though not grim. James shot to his feet, nearly knocking over the untouched coffee. "How is she?" he demanded, throat tight. "The surgery was complex, but we've done everything we can," Dr. Nguyen said, weariness etched in her voice. "We removed compromised tissue. She's in recovery now, and the next 24 hours will be critical. We'll monitor her closely for infection or complications." James exhaled shakily, relief and lingering dread colliding. "Can I see her?" "In a bit. She'll be groggy, one visitor at a time." Andrew patted James's back. "You go. I'll keep Sophie occupied." Moments later, James stepped into the post-op room. Machines beeped softly, a respirator hissed, and Liliana lay still, pale against the white sheets. An IV in her arm dripped pain medication, and a nurse hovered, checking her vitals. She looked so small, so vulnerable. James edged closer, carefully brushing a hand across her forehead. "Lil," he breathed, voice trembling. Her eyelids flickered, then opened a sliver. She seemed disoriented, but a flicker of recognition crossed her face when she saw him. "Hey," he whispered, relief making his eyes sting. "You're out of surgery. Dr. Nguyen said it went as well as they could have hoped." Liliana moved her lips soundlessly at first, then managed a faint whisper. "Hurts." He squeezed her hand gently. "They have you on pain meds. Try to rest." Her hand twitched in his, and though she couldn't muster the strength to speak further, he saw gratitude and a wavering hope glimmer in her eyes. Carefully, he pressed a kiss to her knuckles, as though sealing a silent promise. The hours that followed brought a tedious but necessary vigil. Nurses checked Liliana's vitals, adjusting her medication. James recognized it was too soon to celebrate. She still had to stabilize, and there was no telling how her body would respond once the anesthesia wore off fully. But a quiet sense of triumph nudged him. The surgery, though perilous, was over. A door to potential recovery stood ajar. Eventually, Andrew coaxed James into a quick break for food and to update Sophie. Ms. Anderson held the little girl's hand, guiding her into the hallway once James emerged. Sophie, eyes wide with worry, rushed into James's arms. "She's out of surgery, honey," he murmured, stroking her hair. "We need to be very gentle with Mommy for a while." Sophie nodded, biting her lip. "Can I see her?" "Soon," James promised. "She's very sleepy right now." Looking into Sophie's hopeful eyes, James felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude. Against all odds, against the demands of corporate deals, the ravages of cancer, and their own flawed history, this small family had made it to the cusp of a second chance. The reward wasn't measured in contracts or market shares. It was this, Liliana fighting for life, Sophie awaiting her mother's return, and James discovering that real success meant choosing love over ambition. Standing there, in a hospital hallway that smelled of disinfectant and faint hope, James realized the unstoppable tycoon he'd been was gone. In his place was a man willing to sacrifice power for the people who mattered most. And as he held Sophie close, waiting for Liliana to awaken fully, he knew that was a trade he would make every time. The days following Liliana's surgery felt delicate yet filled with cautious optimism. Outside her hospital window, spring hinted at its arrival, trees budding with fresh leaves, the sun lingering a bit longer each evening. For James, however, life seemed to move in slow motion as he watched over Liliana's recovery. She remained in the post-operative wing, connected to monitors that beeped quietly, each sound a tether to hope. One morning, Dr. Nguyen checked Liliana's vitals and frowned thoughtfully. "Her numbers are improving, but the next week is critical. We need to see how her body responds to the surgery in tandem with the experimental chemotherapy." She glanced at James. "Encourage her to move a little. eat small portions, and keep her spirits up. A positive mindset can help more than you think, James nodded, absorbing each instruction as though it were a precious directive. The man who once wielded power in corporate boardrooms now found himself happily following a doctor's orders if it meant giving Liliana a stronger chance. As Dr. Nguyen left, James turned to Liliana, who rested against her pillows with a tired but determined expression. "You heard the doctor," he said gently, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "Let's see if we can get you up on your feet for a minute or two." Liliana's face scrunched in discomfort. "Everything aches," she mumbled, yet she allowed James to slip a supportive arm beneath her shoulders. Slowly, they eased her upright. Even this small effort left her breathing heavily, but she nodded when he suggested a short shuffle around the room. With painstaking slowness, they took a few steps. Liliana leaned on James and an IV pole, her hospital gown billowing around her slender frame. Though each movement was a battle, something quiet and triumphant glimmered in her eyes. After one lap around the room, she sank back onto the mattress, perspiration beading her forehead. "You did great," James said softly, handing her a small cup of water. In that moment, he realized how monumental each small victory was, how it united them in a way no grand gesture ever could. Soon after, Sophie arrived, led by Miss Anderson. The little girl's face lit up at seeing her mother upright, even if only propped against pillows. She carefully climbed onto a small stool near the bed. "You look better, Mommy," she said earnestly, her green eyes reflecting hope. "Can I show you what I drew today?" Liliana patted the space beside her. "Of course, sweetheart." Her voice, though faint, carried more life than it had in weeks. Sophie proudly unfurled a drawing of two hearts overlapping, crayon lines bright and bold. Inside one heart was Liliana's name, and inside the other, James's name. Sophie had traced both hearts in green crayon, reminiscent of James's eyes, and outlined them in a swirl of red for Liliana's favorite color. "It means we go together," Sophie explained, "like a family." She glanced at James, cheeks coloring. "Is that okay?" A lump formed in James's throat. He cleared it gently. "Yes, that's more than okay." His voice trembled, but the warmth radiating in his chest felt undeniable. Somewhere along this arduous journey, they'd formed bonds deeper than DNA or old grudges. They'd become something akin to a real family. Observing the tender exchange, Mrs. Anderson smiled. "Liliana, it's a relief to see you improving. You've come a long way." Liliana pressed a hand to her chest, inhaling carefully. "I'm not out of the woods yet, but yes, I feel a little stronger each day." She turned her gaze to James. "Thank you for staying." James met her eyes, remembering all the times he'd failed to do so in the past. "I won't pretend I don't have regrets," he said quietly, mindful that Sophie listened, "but at least now I can try to do things right." The rest of the day passed in a comforting haze of small milestones. Liliana managed a few bites of solid food. Sophie's laughter filled the sterile air, and Mrs. Anderson regaled them with cheerful stories about her own grandchildren. A few calls buzzed on James's phone, Catherine Park with updates on the merger, and Andrew checking in on legal affairs. But for the most part, James managed to keep the world's demands at bay. He found a new sense of purpose in making sure Liliana and Sophie felt secure, as though this hospital room was the only place in the universe that really mattered. By evening, a nurse gently ushered Sophie and Mrs. Anderson out, citing visiting hours. Before she left, Sophie hugged James. "I wish we could all go home," she murmured, burying her face briefly against his side. James stroked her hair, fighting a sudden pang of longing. "Me too," he whispered. "Soon, I hope." He walked them to the hospital's exit, heart heavy at Sophie's disappointed expression as she departed. When he returned to Liliana, she was half asleep, a shallow calm in her breathing. He took a seat and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. In the fluorescent half-light, her features seemed gentler, less ravaged by pain than before. He sat watch, neither fully alert nor asleep, letting the hush of the ward lull him into a light doze. In that suspended moment, he felt a shift deep within, a renewal that wasn't dramatic but steady. The proud, aloof James Bennett, who used to close million-dollar deals without blinking, had slowly given way to a man who found joy in the simple act of helping someone he loved stand on her own feet again. And that quiet renewal, he realized, might be the greatest victory he'd ever known. A week later, the doctors finally cleared Liliana for discharge. Though her condition remained fragile, her vitals had stabilized, and the surgical site showed signs of healthy healing. James hovered nearby as a nurse cheerily handed Liliana a sheaf of post-operative instructions, each page detailing medication schedules, follow-up appointments, and dietary recommendations. It was a daunting list, but Liliana managed a wry smile. "I guess this is my new normal," she said, carefully folding the papers into a small folder. James offered an arm to help her into a wheelchair. Hospital policy required every patient leaving the ward to sit in one, even if they felt strong enough to walk. Liliana obliged, though it pinched her pride a bit. Together, they navigated the corridors that had become familiar terrain over the past few months. When they reached the hospital entrance, Sophie jumped up from a nearby bench, Ms. Anderson close behind. "Mummy!" she cried, clapping her hands in excitement. She rushed over, giving Liliana a gentle hug. Ms. Anderson's smile crinkled the corners of her eyes. "They're letting you out," Mrs. Anderson said softly. "It's been quite the journey." Liliana looked around, eyes glistening with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she murmured, her gaze resting on James, Sophie, and Ms. Anderson in turn. Once Liliana was settled in the passenger seat of James's car, Sophie hopped into the back next to Ms. Anderson. The drive to Liliana's apartment felt surreal. James carefully maneuvered through midday traffic, scanning Liliana's face every so often to ensure she felt all right. She leaned her head against the window, the city lights flickering across her features. The apartment building appeared unchanged, red brick, a modest lobby with scuffed floors, the faint odor of someone's cooking drifting from a neighboring unit. Yet for James, everything felt different. The last time he'd helped Liliana into this space, she was too weak to climb even a few steps. Now she walked slowly, but with steadier steps. They entered the apartment. It was neat, well-loved. Sophie's crayons and sketches still scattered on a low table, a cozy couch draped with blankets. James noted a vase of fresh sunflowers on the kitchen counter, courtesy of Miss Anderson, adding a bright touch of hope. Liliana paused in the doorway, taking it all in, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I almost didn't think I'd see this place again," she whispered. "It feels unreal." Sophie tugged at her mother's hand. "You're here, Mommy, and that's what matters." Her voice held a surprising steadiness, as though she'd grown older through this ordeal. James helped Liliana onto the couch while Ms. Anderson quietly excused herself, giving a pat to Sophie's shoulder before leaving. Silence settled as mother and daughter simply savored the relief of being home. James walked into the kitchen, rummaging through cupboards. He wanted to make something simple, maybe a light soup or tea to ease Liliana's transition back to normal food. He found a box of herbal tea, putting water on to boil. Moments later, Liliana's soft voice drifted in from the living room. "James? Could you come here?" He poked his head around the corner, noticing Sophie in Liliana's lap, her little arms curled around her mother in a gentle embrace. "What do you need?" he asked gently. Liliana gave a faint smile. "Just you," she said, nodding for him to join them on the couch. As soon as he sat, Sophie shifted so that all three formed a small circle, arms touching, hearts aligned in a quiet tableau of closeness. They stayed like that for a while, no words needed. Eventually, Sophie wriggled free, bounding over to her coloring materials. James cleared his throat, glancing at Liliana. "How are you really feeling?" "Exhausted, but thankful," she replied, brushing her hair back with a shaky hand. There's so much to figure out. We've spent weeks in crisis mode, but now, I guess we just take it day by day." A ghost of a smile tugged at James's lips. "That seems to be our new motto." She studied him, eyes full of quiet contemplation. "What about your company? The partnership with Blackwell? You can't ignore it forever." He exhaled, recalling the pressure cooker environment he'd left behind. "I'll address it, but Catherine Park and Andrew are handling the operational load. We have a shareholder conference soon. I'll attend, but not until I know you're stable." Liliana reached for his hand, giving it a small squeeze. "I appreciate everything you've sacrificed, but I want you to find a balance. Be the man who cares for his family without losing what he's worked for. That's possible, James." He felt an unexpected warmth at her words. "I'm still learning what that balance looks like, but I'm determined to try." In the kitchen, the kettle whistled, an everyday reminder that life could still be normal in small ways. As James rose to pour the tea, he glanced back at Liliana and Sophie, heart swelling with gratitude. In this changed world, he realized, their presence and well-being were his greatest measures of success. And for the first time, the concept of coming home felt profoundly real. A few days later, James prepared to face the board of directors at Bennett Tech Solutions. The meeting would take place in a hybrid format, a handful of board members in the Manhattan headquarters, others dialing in via video conference. The lingering question, could James Bennett fully resume leadership, and on what terms, given his ongoing personal responsibilities? Before leaving Liliana's apartment, he checked on her. She rested on the couch, a plush throw over her legs, thumbing through an art book she'd once loved. Though her posture still conveyed fatigue, a new spark glowed in her eyes, like an ember fighting to reignite. Sophie was in preschool, providing a lull in the day's routine. "Sure you'll be okay while I'm gone?" James asked, adjusting his jacket collar. Liliana gave him a soft smile. "I'll be fine. Mrs. Anderson will drop by later, and I've got everything I need here." She lifted the art book. "Maybe I'll even try some light sketching, if I feel up to it." The simple promise of creativity made James's chest tighten with emotion. He bent to kiss her cheek. "That sounds perfect." The drive to Bennett Tech Solutions felt oddly nostalgic. The sleek, mirrored high-rise towered against the city skyline, a testament to James's once unwavering pursuit of success. He stepped through the gleaming lobby, old routines flickering in his mind. Yet as he rode the elevator up, he sensed he wasn't the same man who'd strode these halls months ago. Andrew greeted him at the entrance to the boardroom, wearing a rare grin. "Good to see you back," he said, adjusting his tie. "Though I know your heart's still with Liliana and Sophie." James offered a small nod, bracing himself. "Let's get this done." Inside, familiar faces turned to regard him. Catherine Park, a couple of newer board members, and a screen displaying the remote participants. Catherine welcomed James to the table. "Mr. Bennett, I'm glad you could join us. We've prepared a comprehensive overview of the merger's status and your potential role moving forward." Though the conversation began in stiff, formal tones, James noticed subtle shifts among the board. Their questions acknowledged his personal struggles not with critique, but with a tempered respect. Catherine laid out slides showing growth projections, integration steps, and how the new entity, Blackwell Bennett, needed strong leadership. In the final slide, she turned to James. "We propose a co-leadership model," she said. "You, along with me or another appointed executive, to share responsibilities. We recognize your need for flexibility at this time." James leaned forward, elbows on the table. "And this arrangement, would it limit my authority?" Catherine pressed her lips together. "It would modify your responsibilities in the short term. You'd focus on strategic vision and high-level negotiations, while day-to-day operations would remain with a CEO proxy. This helps maintain company stability and gives you space to address personal needs." He glanced at Andrew, who offered a subtle nod of reassurance. James took a moment to weigh the proposal. Not long ago, the mere suggestion of sharing power would have stung his ego, but now, after nearly losing Liliana and discovering the importance of being present for Sophie, everything had changed. "I accept," James finally said, voice steady. "For the time being, co-leadership is the right path. I can't commit to the old schedule, and I won't sacrifice my family's well-being just to keep full control. If this is a workable solution, I'm in." Catherine exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath. Relief flickered across several faces. "Then let's finalize the details over the next few weeks." The rest of the meeting flowed more easily, with questions about timelines, synergy targets, and investor communications. James contributed with measured input, bridging his knowledge of the company's culture with a new willingness to trust others. When the final agenda point wrapped, the board members logged off or stepped out, leaving James and Andrew alone. Andrew placed a hand on James's shoulder. "That was a solid move. By compromising, you're showing true leadership." James's gaze fell to the polished conference table. "I used to think leadership meant having the loudest voice, the final say. But I see now it can also mean enabling others, trusting them." Andrew smiled. "Then maybe your personal journey has become the company's gain." As James stepped back into the hallway, memories rushed him. The late nights spent finalizing mergers, the tense phone calls with Liliana before their divorce, the searing ambition that once consumed him. Now those echoes felt distant, overshadowed by a quieter sense of purpose. He no longer chased success merely for its own sake. Instead, he sought it as a means to support and protect the people he loved. Later that afternoon, he returned to Liliana's apartment. She still lay curled on the couch, but this time a sketchpad rested on her lap, faint charcoal lines depicting blossoming flowers. James's heart lightened at the sight. "Welcome home," she said, glancing up with a gentle smile. He bent to kiss her forehead, setting aside his briefcase. "I'm thinking about the future," he murmured. "Our future. I do want to move step by step, but I can see it. A life where we're together, even if it's different from what we once imagined." Liliana's eyes glistened. "I'd like that, more than anything." In the hush that followed, the warmth of a new beginning enveloped them both. Outside, afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating Liliana's half-finished drawing. In that glowing beam, James saw the promise of a life where family and fulfillment could coexist, shaped by shared wisdom and a commitment to love. 2 months later, Liliana felt strong enough to step outside for a gentle stroll. James accompanied her, carrying a small bag with bottled water and a sweater just in case. Sophie skipped ahead, her laughter ringing across the sidewalk as they made their way to a neighborhood park near Prospect Park. The weather was mild, the sky a brilliant blue, and fresh buds dotted the trees, as if signaling a collective sigh of relief after a long winter. Though Liliana had lost weight and moved at a slower pace, color had returned to her cheeks. Her smile was no longer weighed down by constant pain. Each step felt like a milestone in her recovery, a testament to the battles she'd endured. James, close by her side, found himself watching her every move, not out of anxiety, but admiration. She was a survivor, an artist of both paint and perseverance. At the park's entrance, Sophie pointed to an old-fashioned carousel in the distance. "Can we ride it, please?" she begged, eyes bright with excitement. Liliana exchanged a look with James. "I'd like to watch you two from a bench," she said softly. "I'm not quite up for spinning around just yet." James took Sophie's hand. "Let's do it. Mom can cheer us on." They rode side by side, Sophie gripping a carved wooden horse, James choosing the one behind her. As the carousel turned to a whimsical tune, James found himself grinning, the moment pure and unburdened. Sophie's laughter echoed, reminding him how precious these everyday joys had become. With every revolution, he felt a weight lift, replaced by gratitude that this child, once unknown to him, was now woven into his world. Afterward, they returned to Liliana, who sat on a green-painted bench. Soft sunbeams caught in her hair, giving it a warm sheen. Sophie clambered onto the bench beside her mother, recounting every detail of the ride with animated gestures. Liliana listened intently, occasionally brushing a stray hair from Sophie's forehead. The sight of them together stirred an ache of fulfillment in James's chest, an ache he'd never known before. They wandered through the park a bit more, eventually finding a shaded area to sit on the grass. Ms. Anderson appeared. She'd promised to meet them, carrying a small picnic basket with sandwiches and fruit. As they all settled onto the ground, a sense of closeness enveloped them. Ms. Anderson busied herself handing out paper napkins, while Sophie rummaged through the basket for cookies. Liliana leaned against James, taking a moment to catch her breath. "Do you remember," she began, voice tinged with memory, "how you once insisted you hated parks? You said nature bored you because deals got made in boardrooms." James let out a rueful laugh. "I've been known to say a lot of foolish things." She brushed a hand over his, lacing their fingers. "Well, it turns out real life and real happiness happens in places like this, with people who matter." She looked at Sophie, who was giggling over Miss Anderson's teasing remarks, and then back at James. "I'm just glad we found our way here." A gentle breeze stirred the budding leaves overhead. James found himself thinking back to all the moments that led them here. The heartbreaking day he learned of Sophie's existence, the hospital vigils, the merger crisis, and the quiet revelations that shaped his soul. The man who once measured success only by corporate achievements now realized how limiting that yardstick had been. Sophie bounded over, offering Liliana a cookie with a flourish. "It has chocolate chips," she announced proudly. "That's good for you, right?" She looked uncertain, recalling her mother's many dietary restrictions. Liliana chuckled, nodding. "In moderation, chocolate is one of life's greatest pleasures." Relieved, Sophie handed one to James as well. He took a bite, savoring the sweetness. "Thank you," he murmured, tousling Sophie's hair. "This is exactly what I need." In that simple exchange, James recognized how far they'd come, and how each day remained a triumph over past regrets and old fears. Reaching out to Ms. Anderson, he gave her a grateful smile. "I'm not sure we'll ever repay your kindness." She waved a dismissive hand. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just loved that little girl, and I saw how much Liliana needed support. And you," she added, fixing him with a knowing look, "were searching for something bigger than your bank balance, whether you realized it or not." For a moment, James couldn't speak. He merely nodded. Eventually, he cleared his throat. "I guess I found it." Afternoon drifted into early evening, the sky turning a gentle lavender. They walked back to Liliana's apartment together, Sophie skipping a few steps ahead. Once at the door, Ms. Anderson parted ways, leaving James, Liliana, and Sophie standing in a warm hush. The hallway's overhead light flickered softly. Sophie let out a contented sigh. This was the best day," she declared, hugging her stuffed bunny. "Mommy's better. We went to the park and we're all together." Liliana looked at James, emotion bright in her eyes. "She's right." He nodded, keys jingling in his hand. "Yeah," he agreed quietly, voice thick with gratitude. "It really is the best day." In that shared moment, at the threshold of a home made brighter by love rather than luxury, they found the ending of one story and the promise of countless new ones. A story of second chances, of a man learning that true wealth is measured in laughter and closeness, and a woman discovering the strength to trust again. And so they entered, hearts brimming, to build a future that might not be perfect but would be real, hopeful, and deeply, poignantly theirs. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.